He just
Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. It's Craig Truglia, and with me today is Father John and Father Joseph. How are you guys doing today?
Good, thank you.
Doing good.
Well, it's good to have you both back on. Our previous show on the topic of ROCOR and the true Orthodox split was on the schism, but we kept going into these other issues about essentially who's right, who's wrong. And we didn't get to really unpack a lot of those in our last show. So I'm hoping today we'll give both sides in a quasi-debate-ish format, though not quite, be kind of a guided interview as well, to really unpack some of those issues for those who are curious. And before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that your donations to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate do make possible the missionary work in Cambodia. So if programming like this is a blessing to you and you find helpful, please pass that blessing forward, either to a charity like that or any way of giving alms. And let me now get to the guest, who also will, in the end, do their plugs, and we have their websites and everything. I want to give you guys an opportunity to kind of make your case in brief in about 5 minutes of why you are on the right side of this question and this schism that tragically does exist. So I will give Father Joseph the first opening statement, and then Father John, you could follow his.
Okay. Well, first off, let me just begin by talking about saying thank you for having me to Patrick Craig Truglia, and thank you to Father John for taking the opportunity to have this discussion. It is contentious. It's complicated. But we're going to kind of declutter it, and that's part of the reason why I asked for an opening statement. One of the problems of our last discussion is that it wasn't really clear who anyone was or who represented who where, and I'm going to explain that in a little bit because it could lead to confusion when people are talking about true Orthodoxy and world Orthodoxy, etc. I'm hoping to clarify this in this introduction. Let me start by saying that there are true Orthodox all over the world. We're talking 2025. One can be true Orthodox, communicate with other Orthodox people worldwide, and never even deal with the state-sanctioned hierarchies. And to an outsider in the official churches in world Orthodoxy, it might not be clear that true Orthodoxy's existence is almost largely in a parallel world that doesn't actually involve them at all. For example, I have people I go to church with that I could go to church with in Romania, in Greece, in Russia, in Georgia, in Latin America. To some degree, in their own lives, we have fully formed hierarchies, so on and so forth. And this has been developed over time. This has been developed over decades of dealing with persecution, etc. A good example of this is just to give you an idea, because there's time involved in this as well, the True Orthodox Church of Romania, which generally has agreed to number over 3 million Romanians. It's headed by Metropolitan of Logiev. There are smaller hierarchies in Romania, but he's in charge of the largest. And yet the True Orthodox Romanians, for example, don't call him a patriarch. Now, one can easily presume that this is because when the apostasy of Ecumenism began, there was no such thing as a patriarch of Romania. Only a metropolitan of Romania. Could the True Orthodox of Romania elevate him to a patriarchate? Well, they could, but they appear to show no interest. In fact, many of what the official church calls traditional Orthodox jurisdictions and patriarchates didn't even exist 100 years ago. The OCA didn't. The Church of Poland didn't. Finland didn't. Estonia didn't. Albania didn't. Others didn't either. And they were all uncanonically carved out by the Patriarchate of Constantinople after the disaster of the Russian Revolution. As such, we have our own Orthodox churches in these lands, but don't come up with parallel hierarchies because the parallel hierarchies themselves are uncanonical to us in terms of following proper history. But in this, and this is the hard part, in this parallel world of ours, we also include ROCOR. Because in her early days, ROCOR kind of was there as the Orthodox world shattered and fell apart, and would react kind of as a watcher outside in terms of what you would call world Orthodoxy. Today, what is considered ROCOR in the state-sanctioned churches is what on our side we call ROCOR MP, because we have continuing ROCOR people who came from all of these divisions that occurred since 2000, which true Orthodox don't, we don't consider ROCOR MP to be the legitimate ROCOR, but only a transformed arm of the Moscow Patriarchate at this point. Historically, and I'm sure Father John would agree with this, the ROCOR formed through the publication of Patriarch St. Tikhon's Ukaz 362, which gave guidelines for bishops both inside and outside Russia to rule their dioceses and form what were known as THCAs, or temporary higher church authorities, when bishops could unite and continue self-administration of the church until the convocation of a free all-Russian council. Thus, those opposing this form of organization historically over the decades, especially the earliest decades, were usually those in the Soviet Moscow Patriarchate.
Well, Father Joseph, you're aware you're at your 5 minutes, but I'll give you another minute to finish up.
All right, I do apologize, and please give Father John the same. So they were usually in the Soviet Moscow Patriarchate, who didn't regard St. Tikhon anyway, and just preferred to yell "Sesmatic" at them or have them killed, but that's another story. Many in the historic and continuing ROCOR and Free Russian dioceses and synods had their properties confiscated from them through a variety of legally questionable schemes. With that in place, since I have a few seconds here, I want to explain that we have a divergence of two different worlds that we're talking about that to some degree, a lot of people, especially who aren't familiar with true Orthodoxy, have no idea about. And that is going to be something that will affect and color this debate as we go on. Again, thank you for having me, and my time.
No, without further ado, Father John, I'll give you 5 minutes to make the case that ROCOR is on the right side of this divide.
The history of the old calendar is a complicated one. And the history of ROCOR's interaction with them is also complicated. I've always been sympathetic with people who are in the various old calendar groups, especially the ones that I know to be sincere. And I know that many of them have wound up in those groups because they've seen things in different local churches that were scandalous, and I think that those things, in most cases, I would say that there was legitimate reasons to object to them. But the question is, at what point do you bail out of communion with the rest of the church altogether because there's these kinds of things that are happening? And so we'll be talking about that in more detail, but in brief, what I would point out is that when the old calendar movement began, it began not because of any theological issue. It was because of the calendar. It wasn't because of ecumenism. It wasn't because of modernism. And people didn't cite those things at the time. It was only in retrospective that they started attaching that to, having some connection with ecumenism. And if the old calendarists are right for taking the positions that they have and cutting off and declaring other churches to be without grace and that sort of thing, the old believers were even more right to have done it back in the nearly 400 years ago, because there you had the Russian government with the cooperation of the Russian church doing a lot of things that were not particularly good. They anathematized traditions that people had practiced all their life because the Tsar, and at that time, to some extent, the Patriarch Nikon had decided they were trying to bring everybody in the Russian church into conformity with what they understood the Greek practice to be. And yet the saints of our church since then never thought that was justified for them to have done it. And so it is complicated, and in ROCOR's history, there has been some sympathy for the Greek old calendarists, but in the cases where we actually entered into communion with them, it really didn't last very long, and it was primarily because of issues like the fact that the old calendarists were unable to get along with each other. And also, one other thing I should say real quickly, but can probably run out of time, is that one of the attacks on ROCOR is that, well, we're not adhering to what old ROCOR believed. And I would just say very briefly that prior to 1998 in ROCOR, you had a lot of different opinions about the Moscow Patriarchate and some different opinions about other local churches. And then all that started to hit the fan when the Soviet Union collapsed, but not immediately, actually. Up until about 1998, if you were online, you would have found people like myself, Father John Shaw, now Bishop Jerome, people who are very who wound up going into schism later, all singing from the same hymn book as far as our positions were. But what happened was Metropolitan Vitali, throughout this whole issue of whether or not the other churches had grace or not, outside of actually in contradiction to what the Synod of Bishops had said. And this caused a lot of unfortunate division. But the idea that everybody in ROCOR took the same position that Metropolitan Vitali or even Metropolitan Filaret did is just not the case. That they did reflect a position that a lot of people had, but it wasn't, I don't think, even the majority opinion. It was certainly not the views that the people I was encountering in ROCOR believed. I only encountered people who held those beliefs very rarely. It was usually like at clergy meetings or at missions conferences. And so the positions that ROCOR historically took is that we are temporarily separated from the Moscow Patriarchate until the end of Soviet domination. St. John actually he began commemorating Patriarch Alexei I at the end of World War II because he thought that the Synod of Bishops had ceased to function. Okay, he thought that they had ceased to function, and he believed that Patriarch Alexei I was canonically elected, and he defended his decision. But then when he found out that ROCOR was continuing to function, he ceased commemorating Patriarch Alexei II. He also had a different view than Metropolitan Filaret on other branches or parts of the Russian Church that had separated from ROCOR. And he mentions that in his letters. He says, I don't understand the position of Vladika John, though he was a true arch-pastor. So the idea that it was only that view and that people who don't agree with that view are some sort of newfangled ROCOR that have no continuity with what was before is just simply not true. We are in continuity with St. John, which I think is a pretty good person to be with.
And I'll be personally pushing back on both sides a little bit in order to get the conversation along in this. As pictured, though it's kind of hard to see with all of us in front, but that's Jordanville from the cemetery behind the church. And we would have St. Filaret, though not officially canonized in ROCOR, and at least ROCOR MP, as Father Joseph would call it, there in the back. But he's considered a saint at Jordanville. So we'll have, like in some questions in church debates, saints on both sides ultimately. So let me distill the issue of Sergianism, and then I'm going to pose the question two different ways to both sides, try to tease out some different ideas here. Now, but before I do that, let me ask you for an agreed upon definition for Sergianism. In our last interview, it sounded like what both sides said was that Sergianism at its core was not only willing compliance with an atheistic state, but particularly in addition to this, would have been lying about and thereby enabling, if not directly enabling, the persecution of Christians. Is this a correct definition of Sergianism, or is there something else I need to add? Either Father Joseph, that sound correct, or something you want to add real quickly?
Well, you mentioned you wanted to distill it. So if we could take it from Braga to vodka, it's a distillation joke if you don't get it. But anyway, the point is, it would be betraying the church in the name of serving it, ultimately. So the lying, etc. Basically, if you were to do things, betraying to the authorities, lying about the state of the church, but you're doing it in the name of saving the church, you're literally doing the opposite of serving Christ. You're serving Antichrist.
Okay, and so does that sound correct? Would you agree with this definition, Father John?
Yeah, I think that that's more or less what the word's been taken to mean.
And now let me ask you this, Father John. This was popularly called a heresy by ROCOR for decades. How is this properly a doctrinal issue and not an issue of practice or application?
I'm not sure that I agree that it was really a heresy. I think it was, a capitulation. When you found the extreme forms of it, and I would compare it a lot to what happened during the persecutions under the Romans, where you had bishops that were traditors. In other words, they handed over church books to be burned and that sort of thing, and that was considered to be an act of apostasy.
So if I could push back a little bit, so you would say that in your understanding that Sergianism wasn't properly a heretical ideology, and the reason I asked this to confirm, because like in the early church with the traditors, there's no like traditorism, being someone who turns in the books is wrong, being apostate is wrong, but it never was turned into an ism. So am I understanding you right on this question?
Yeah, I mean, the only way I suppose you could make it into a teaching would be if you were talking about people who were defending what the Russian church did. But if you look at what people defended, I don't know that people defended actual betrayal of the church. What they defended was things like trying to find some way forward with the Soviet government, which Father Daniel Sasoyev actually did. And, Father Daniel in his letters was responding to someone who was asking about this question. He basically said that what Sergius did was not unlike what Patriarch Tikhon or Saint Tikhon did when he basically tried to come to some kind of terms with the Soviets so that he wouldn't be under house arrest and churches would be allowed to function. And, we don't accuse Patriarch Tikhon of being a Sergianist. But the thing is, obviously, there are bishops that probably went beyond the line that you could defend, as far as the kind of actions they took. But a bishop that was trying to find some way to, to keep churches open, but was not actually getting people thrown into the gulags and executed or anything like that, I don't know. I don't think you could call that a heresy, at least. I mean, you might say that it was a weakness in some cases, and it certainly was, but I don't know that you'd say it was a heresy.
Would you confirm or deny that what became Patriarch Sergius, that he essentially used the Soviet state to imprison some of his, ecclesiastical enemies in competition?
I've not read like a detailed biography, certainly not one that tried to lay out all the cases where he crossed the line. I certainly know that there were cases like in Russia's catacomb saints, there's accounts of people going to him and asking him to do something and him saying things like, what persecution or something like that. Now, the question I think you have to ask in a situation like that is did he think that he was being monitored when he was being asked the question? I don't know. But there's an interesting story from Father John Christiankin, who I think was a saint. He was an elder, a clairvoyant elder at the Skull Caves that you read about in Everyday Saints and in some other places. But he had a dream when he was maybe before he was even a monk, but he had thought very badly of Patriarch or Metropolitan Sergius, as ROCOR always referred to him. And he had a dream that he was in church and Metropolitan Sergius was passing him by. And then he turned and he looked at him. He said, "I know you judged me harshly, but just know that I repented." Whether that was just a dream or not, I don't know. But I have a high opinion of Father John Christiankin. I think he was a saint. And I think that story is worthy of at least some credence.
Now, let me ask, and this won't be the majority of the question for you, Father Joseph, but I do want to give you an ability to respond or to clarify something. So would you confirm or deny that Sergianism is properly a doctrinal heresy?
Yes, I would definitely do that. That is part of the reason why.
So yes, what? Confirming or denying?
I would confirm it as a doctrinal heresy.
And could you explain to the audience how that is?
Well, if you remember just a few moments ago, I was talking about how distilling it to its essence means that it is betraying the church in the name of saving it, which is effectively serving Antichrist in the name of serving Christ. We can find this directly from Sergius's initial statement that caused all the problems, where he says the joys and sorrows of the Soviet state are the joys and sorrows of the church. This is a lie. They're not the joys and sorrows of the church. But the lying, which was a big part of it, because he did lie before the World Council of Churches, he did lie before the catacomnics, is only one part of it. Once you are willing to serve Antichrist in the name of serving Christ, at that point you're capable of doing anything, reporting.
Now, let me push back a tiny bit, because I think it'll help you make your point. It just sounds like he was a jerk.
No, it doesn't.
So how is that? So make the case it's not him merely being a jerk, but it's doctrinal.
He's murdering Christians. Does that help?
A murderous jerk. Hitler was a jerk too.
No.
I'm just trying to find where the doctrinal aspect of this is.
Okay, the point is, if you are submitting members of the church to trial and you're bringing them to authorities for execution, you are not just being a jerk. He could have been the friendliest person on earth, and many people, especially in the Moscow Patriarchate, remember him very fondly for being a friendly person. But that just means he's a friendly murderer. And he's a friendly murderer in the name of Christ. That is a contradiction in terms. That is what servitude to Antichrist is. I would like to go back, and I would like to mention a few things, because Father John did mention the old believers. I have to point.
That's not the topic right now, please forgive me.
No problem. We can stick to Sergius being an Antichrist murderer.
But let me pose one other thing to give you an opportunity to push back to directly what Father John just said, which would be, do we have evidence that Patriarch Sergius was in fact using and cooperating with the state in order to be a direct part of persecution? And could you explain that?
You can find things like that in the Metric in our archive. Yes, these things are well documented. One of the problems of our last kind of discussion was the idea that because everyone in the hierarchy of the Moscow Patriarchate had KGB code names, that they were just simple code names, etc. No, especially in the earliest period, there were often registered agents who were operating as part of the intelligence apparatus of the Soviet Union. In many cases, yes, they were involved in the transfer of catacomnics, of Josephites, and were informed on their locations, etc., for their roundup and murder. Their martyrdoms. This is not disputed by any reputable source outside of the Moscow Patriarchate itself. But the documents were all there. They were all revealed in the 1990s. This is part of the reason why, when the and this is something that.
So would it be fair to say that it would be whitewashing Patriarch Sergius to say that he was not himself a direct persecutor of the Orthodox Christians in Russia?
I would say that would be whitewashing not only Sergius, but Alexis, Pimen.
And would it be fair to say essentially the whole Moscow Patriarchate apparatus for much of the time the Soviet Union at minimum?
Yes.
Let me ask this follow-up question then. Did this at any point stop? Right, speaking secular history, Khrushchev is considered the last time of overt Soviet persecution of the church. Did Sergianism ever stop or dissipate or mutate? Does it still exist today instead of the KGB? There's FSB. Could you explain why?
Because again, once you have chosen to serve, for lack of a better word, Antichrist instead of Christ in the name of serving Christ, even if the Antichrist system falls, that just means that people who were willing to do that, besides being heretical, become opportunist. There's in other words, once the Soviet Union fell, many of the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate were no longer nearly as interested in protecting the Soviet security apparatus, although they were interested in maintaining power, but they often entered into business ventures, or they entered into other aspects of Russian life where they could make a profit. Unfortunately, that's what people who are intelligence agents who suddenly don't have a job do. I mean, this is true of the samurai and the ronin. This has gone on since time began. But were they functional bishops, or were they functional KGB, FSB agents? I would say the latter.
Now, let me ask this question. What's your feelings about the Peter the Great reforms, where like they had a gay procurator with Alexander Golitsyn? They allowed Scottish missionaries to work in the Crimea, and so literally enabling the propagation of heresy, the limitation of monasticism. How was Sergianism worse than, let's say, those deforms of Peter the Great?
Okay. I do realize that, that was interesting that you said that. Peter the Great's punishments, because most of the time we deal with the closing of monasteries, although the truth of the matter is historically he kept many of them open because they served financial interest to the state and allowed him to pay for other educational reforms. Usually I hear about cruelty and violence. Unfortunately, if we compare that violence to what was going on in England or France at the exact same time, the punishments were almost standardized, with the possible exception of the mass beheading, but beheadings were often common and multiple. And I'm not picking this on you or on Father John, because I've heard this. Remember, I'm outside the bubble. I've heard this for decades. But I have to start by saying comparing Peter the Great to Lenin or Stalin actually comes from Soviet equivocation. This was very common in the 1960s. You'd say something like, I heard something bad happened in the church and some people were killed. And they'd be like, what about Peter the Great? It was a common thing. The application of Tuquoque to a Tsar who died in the communion of the church against someone who mass murdered Christians for being Christians and aimed for the absolute destruction of the church isn't just fallacious. It's morally reprehensible. Not everything Peter the Great did was bad for the church. He did some stupid things. He did some bad things, but he also did many good things. And he also opened up schools for the children of priests.
So what let me then ask this, and I got to give Father John some time. Who's worse for Orthodox Christianity, Vladimir Putin or Peter the Great? Who's more overtly trying to manipulate Orthodox doctrine?
Are you asking me that question, or are you asking?
Father Joseph, and then okay. I'll give you the opportunity to respond.
Okay.
Oh, you're asking me that question?
Yes, because because right, the argument is that Sergianism has never stopped. That hasn't been. It hasn't been.
I would say that,
officially denounced by the Moscow Patriarchate. So the implication is it's just continuing under Putin. And so my question to you then is, being that Putin's not killing Orthodox Christians, and now it gets us back to just on the doctrinal level, who's worse, Peter the Great or Putin?
And you're going to hate me for this answer. It's Putin. And the reason why
and please please explain. It helps us understand your position.
It's not going to be like, it's not going to be a harshly negative more as it is going to be a lack of a positive. And what I mean by that is that Vladimir Putin is often interested in the interaction of different parts of the Russian state. So he becomes sort of ecumenistic when it comes to things like Islam or Rabbinic Judaism, etc. And he kind of,
well, Peter the Great was with. I'm going to push back. Peter the Great was with Protestantism.
Well, and that's still not even a comparison, because I was only getting started. My point was that when it came to the old believers, for example, Peter the Great was incredibly repressive towards some obvious heretics, and he also was repressive towards Roman Catholics. In case you weren't aware of that, so he might have just thought the Protestants seemed more manipulable, more malleable than the others. But when it comes to Putin, while Medvedev was worse in terms of actual persecution and seizures of true Orthodox property, Putin is almost hands-off when it comes to anything related to religion. He just like, religion is good, of tradition in the West, and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to go focus on biometric.
Yeah, pay your taxes and make more citizens to fight our wars. I get it.
In other words, he had no big moral positive as opposed to Peter the Great, who at least
So
had that.
people are going to hate this, but we got to move the conversation forward. It's the way we pack as much in as much time as possible. So I was throwing some hardballs at Father Joseph. So now, Father John, this is your turn. Is ROCOR getting more liberal? I mean, the men and women standing in separate sides is dissipating. They're in Russia. They're starting to kneel on Sundays during communion, which was unheard of and still unheard of ROCOR, at least outside of Russia. They commune on Sundays without attending vigil. These are all things I've seen in Moscow Patriarchate churches, and it's catching on in ROCOR churches. I'm a newcomer in this, so is this the idea that ROCOR is getting more liberal? Is this sort of a false impression? And you've been in this in decades to see otherwise. So let me pose that question to you. Is ROCOR getting more liberal?
Well, ROCOR is a lot more conservative than it was, say, back in the 1950s when you had Metropolitan Vitali being consecrated in an Anglican church with a vested Anglican bishop, standing on the cleros. There's a lot of things that happened in the early days of ROCOR that would never happen now. But I want to push back on a couple of things Father Joseph said. One is he made the statement in a previous show, and he made it again, that the old believers were heretics. I've never heard any of our bishops or any of our saints refer to the old believers as heretics. They've always been referred to as being schismatics. And Russians,
you can't say that about all.
Well, guys, we gotta stay on topic. Point taken, Father. But so you would say ROCOR is not getting more liberal?
No, and also one other thing I would like to talk about, though, that he mentioned the Matrokin archives. This was handwritten notes by a KGB agent that were fed to British intelligence, and if you think that you can trust British intelligence to give an accurate depiction of the Russian Church, I don't. And because someone's a former KGB agent and they're telling, spilling the beans, as it would appear at least, on things that were going on during the Soviet period, doesn't mean that they're being honest. It could just mean that they're just working for another master, and these are not necessarily trustworthy people.
If I can just interject on that, very simply.
40 words or less interjection, then we'll move on to the next topic.
No problem. Can you name a member of British intelligence who killed clergymen of the Russian Church?
Well, they certainly facilitated the killing of clergy of the Russian Church in Ukraine in the last 8 years. They facilitated that. Yes,
I find that okay. That's kind of ludicrous, but it's okay. Cool.
It's happened, and they put the fake church in place, and they've encouraged the government to.
Next topic.
British agents didn't kill any Russian clergy.
It's the point that Father John is making is that the British intelligence has been instrumental in enabling the persecutions in Ukraine that's had those effects.
And they don't tell the truth.
Your point is that the British intelligence isn't directly a instrument of persecution.
Whereas the KGB and the FSB were.
Understood. Now let's talk about the World Council of Churches.
Do I get to answer on the ROCOR getting more liberal?
Sure. I'll give you a quick opportunity for that. Take a minute.
Okay. In the first place, I'm just going to point out that the reason why we can't really say ROCOR is more or less liberal, ROCOR MP is not an independent body like the Free ROCOR, the Free Russian churches. It has to recognize, due to communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, all of the ecumenist excesses of European state churches is valid and permissible, at the very least. It doesn't have to say they're good, but it has to accept they're permissible. That indicates that they, in some ways, are more liberal. And finally, in the end, ROCOR MP now, whether tacitly or not, does support the persecution of true Orthodox and even ROCOR parishes and clergy who are in the bosom of historical ROCOR, not limited to Russian state policy, which facilitates the closure and seizure of parish buildings and artifacts. So for us, true Orthodox, it's never whether ROCOR is becoming more liberal, because even the Soviet Union under Stalin or Brezhnev could be politically characterized as conservative.
All right, we just left the topic of liberalness. So we'll move forward to the next topic, the World Council of Churches.
Okay.
Father Joseph, the World Council of Churches, I'm I'm going to pose it to you in this way, and I'm going to pose it differently to Father John. So I'm going to pose it to you like this. They're not having the prayer services and stuff where it conflates that there's everyone's of the same church and everything. What's the real problem with the World Council of Churches today?
Okay, well, if we're going to go right to it, if you look at what the definition of the World Council of Churches is in the current charter, the World Council of Churches is a fellowship of churches of differing traditions and confessions. That's in the basis of the World Council of Churches. Thus, the question of dogmatic difference is not even central to the World Council of Churches. There are parts in the World Council of Churches constitutions which indicate, quite frankly, discussions of dogmatic differences are welcomed. But what's not ever really negotiable is whether you can be a member or not of the World Council of Churches. So, in a sense, there's intentionally no mechanism for resolution of doctrinal differences. As long as everyone stays in the big umbrella, it doesn't matter whether you say we are the true church and none of you are. You're still under the umbrella. You're still under the super church. And I will note that the protests that the Moscow Patriarchate and some others made to the World Council of Churches as Orthodox concerns was itself ecumenical, because in those were signed documents and protests with the Monophysites, meaning that even the condemnation of Ecumenist World Council of Churches ecclesiology itself stemmed from Ecumenist World Council of Churches ecclesiology. Ultimately, Moscow's recent work with the WCC, I know you're familiar with the situation with Ukraine, Father, shows that the MP continues to use the World Council of Churches to further the Kremlin's political goals, in this case, it's let's not talk about the war in Ukraine, because a whole bunch of churches talking to the WCC want the WCC to condemn the Russian state. And so
let me throw one more hardball, and then Father John's going to get a couple. This is, again, there being a jerk argument, right? Political corruption. What's the doctrinal issue in this? That's for you, Father Joseph.
Oh, that's for me?
Yes.
Well, the doctrinal issue is it's not an issue of jerk or no jerk. It's an issue of true or not true. The concept of truth is not valid in the WCC. There is no concept of truth. And so you must at least accept that a priori before making your statement, etc. And
okay. So I think that sums up your point well there. Now, Father John, let me throw this hardball at you. ROCOR was very much against the World Council of Churches, really still isn't represented in the World Council of Churches. That's just left to the MP and certain other jurisdictions. But there are Orthodox jurisdictions like Bulgaria and Georgia that don't take part. And so has ROCOR today lost their idealism in not being as strongly against World Council of Churches, or this has become sort of a non-issue?
Well, if it was up to me, the Russian Church or no Orthodox Church would be part of the World Council of Churches, but I can understand the arguments for why they're there. And they have made statements that make it clear that they believe that they're the one true church. And so they're not, by being members, declaring that that's not true. But I think that a lot of people see the World Council of Churches as sort of like a United Nations thing, mainly as a means of communicating on a religious level, because unfortunately you do have wars that involve religious aspects to them. And so I don't see a problem with, for example, a Russian bishop that's trying to have good relations with people of other religions or other denominations so that their people are not killing each other. I don't think that's a compromise of the faith. Now, I think the main reason why the Russian Church is still in the WCC is because the Ecumenical Patriarchate remains in the WCC, and they don't want to cede the floor to them. And but if it was up to me, they would be out. But I think I can at least understand why not everyone would agree with that.
Now, let me ask this question on the issue of politics, which would be political motivations for the union of the Moscow Patriarchate with ROCOR, and political motivations against it. So let me pose this to you, Father John, which would be, didn't, let's say, Vladimir Putin exert political pressure to have ROCOR and Moscow Patriarchate reconcile, because this would be a way of him projecting soft power across his borders?
I wouldn't say that he used political pressure, because I'm not sure what political pressure he would have had on ROCOR to have exerted any pressure. He certainly did express a desire to see something happen with our bishops, but Metropolitan Loris wasn't afraid that Vladimir Putin was going to come and shoot his dog or something. He was willing to talk about that, and the charter of ROCOR specifically stated that when the Soviet domination ended, that there was the need for the Russian Church abroad to give an account and to come back to terms with the church inside of Russia. And again, whatever you want to say about the Moscow Patriarchate or Metropolitan Sergius, St. John of Shanghai had a more charitable view of Metropolitan Sergius than Father Joseph Sweden, and or Metropolitan Vitali for that matter.
All right, well, okay. No, all right. So, Father Joseph, let me pose the question to you this way, and I give you permission to exchange one barb with Father John in order to even out the universe. And weren't there political motivations to keep ROCOR and the Moscow Patriarchate separate, particularly from the West and in the United States? I remember both you and Father John joking last time that both sides had feds because there have been a motivation to keep them apart. So isn't that an example of there being political pressure applied to ROCOR to stay apart from the Moscow Patriarchate?
Yeah, I would say that there was political pressure. It's just a question of whether the motivation was good for the church or not, is what I would say. Now, I would like to counter Barb to Father John that St. John of Shanghai, after realizing the synod was alive, went to the synod and repented, and I hope that Father John does the same. In any case...
Now, let me ask one follow-up on that note. I know that from reading about St. Philaret of New York that something very similar happened to him. Did it happen with both men, that in order to join ROCOR, they had to denounce the Moscow Patriarchate? How am I... Because I'm sure that's about Philaret.
Yeah, St. Philaret also he did. Yeah, that was actually standard procedure for priests all the way up to the 90s.
I just wanted to clarify.
I've never seen any written repentance of St. John of what he did. Now, he might have said, "I'm sorry that I didn't check or was unaware."
Father John, it's not a written repentance, and you know that. You go before the church, before the bishop.
Okay, and what date did this happen, and what did he say? I don't think that he made the renunciation of Sergianism, but I don't think that he did. That was something that was done for clergy that were coming from the Moscow Patriarchate, but in this case, he had simply thought that ROCOR had ceased to exist, began commemorating the Patriarch of Moscow, and then when he found out differently, he stopped.
Well, first off, I don't know the time, but I'm not going to simply accept I had understood that St. John did repent once he realized the truth of the situation outside.
I'd have to see a record of it.
Well, and that's fine. But the point is, I wouldn't say.
And we could follow up, and there's a lot of topics here. We could follow up the com box with any details and citations.
Can I also mention one thing? Because
I don't want to lose a good comment, so mention it very fast.
Okay. One thing I should mention is that while we're talking about St. John and his views on the Moscow Patriarchate, even in 1992, Bishop Hilarion, who would later become Metropolitan Hilarion, was asked what are the conditions necessary for achieving union with the Moscow Patriarchate. And at least the first one was basically repenting of Sergianism. The second one was talking about how harmful it was to the church. The third one was about withdrawing from any active participation in the ecumenical movement. And the fourth one was literally all hierarchs and priests have to repent of being pawns of the KGB. So I am curious as to how my position is inconsistent with historical ROCOR when that was written by your previous first hierarch.
Okay, so let me... and you guys will have last words, so if you feel like you really got to respond to something...
No, I'm good. I'm good, thanks.
Hold it in. But I want to move to another topic, which is the issue of whether there's grace in global orthodoxy, because ROCOR had been not properly within global orthodoxy for a good long while. And so this is a question with discerning on both sides. So we see this alleged quote. I say alleged not because it's false, because I just don't have a proper citation. It says, for outside of orthodoxy, there's no grace, and the Soviet Church has deprived itself of grace. And, taken literally, would seem to be no grace outside of World Orthodoxy. So let me ask you. Let me ask you this, Father Joseph. Is global Orthodoxy graceless? And add whatever nuances and things you have to add in order to answer that question properly. Because I know it's not a yes or no strictly.
Okay, let us just clarify the standard Orthodox teaching on schism. And that is, schismatics have no grace. So the simple answer to the question among true Orthodox all over the world is yes. And the simple answer, according to the hierarchy of world Orthodoxy all over the world, is yes. It's worth noting that true Orthodoxy is also global, so it's not an apples to oranges comparison. True Orthodoxy is just as global. In the two major Orthodox jurisdictions, historically the Greek and the Russian jurisdictions, there are sufficient bishops for long-term survival on both sides. Sizable minorities of true Orthodox in the general populations of Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, and I could go on, Georgia. There are true Orthodox communities throughout 6 of Earth's 7 continents, roughly on par with world Orthodoxy, although the Moscow Patriarchate
I do get off a little off the beaten path here. And you're not going to hurt feelings to answer this question, so I'll pose it more directly, is if you're not part of the proper true Orthodox jurisdiction, is there no salvation outside of their communion? Just like St. Cyprian said, there's no salvation outside the church.
I would say if you have the Orthodox faith and you're not a formal schismatic, you have grace. I would not say like that's that whole tangential communion thing.
And so is your argument that there's grace, but not particularly in the jurisdictional level, but among the faithful of these different Orthodox jurisdictions?
Yeah, as long as they're confessing the true Orthodox faith, not Ecumenism, not Sergianism, so on and so forth, yeah. Okay, and now let me ask this question, because I think it'd be pretty clear Father John would say there's grace, right? You'd say, yes, there's grace among the global Orthodox.
I would like to address the quote from Metropolitan Filaret that was put on the screen, if I could.
Sure.
The thing is you have to note that he's saying there's no grace in the Moscow Patriarchate. And he's not saying anything about any other jurisdiction. Father Alexander Lebedev was his assistant when he was the Metropolitan for several years, and he wrote a letter to Father Nikitas Palasis when the Panalamonites went into schism from ROCOR in 1986 because they were covering up for a sexual predator. And Father Alexander asserted in this letter that Metropolitan Filaret served with bishops of other jurisdictions on many occasions,
but not the Greek Archdiocese. And
he not just the Serbs, though. He mentioned of many other local churches. And the thing is, there's a video that was recently posted that has Metropolitan Filaret's voice in a sermon, basically making the same kind of a statement that I don't believe there's any grace in the Moscow Patriarchate. He says, I don't impose this view on anyone else, but that is my opinion. Okay. That was Metropolitan Filaret's opinion.
Well, St. Filaret, you've made the accusation that he served with the Serbs, and there's no evidence he did that. He actually issued disciplinary statements against people who did serve with the Serbs. So the idea that he served with the Serbs when he was disciplining his priests for serving with them is ludicrous.
Well, Father Alexander Lebedev was there, so I wasn't. But the thing is, I know that Subdeacon Nectarius found a decision that was made like in 1967 about serving with the Serbian bishops.
Well, that was just a continuation of the previous policy that had been held, but more importantly, that was happening in England in contradistinction to what Anthony of Geneva was doing, because he was starting to push for communion with the Serbs, and this actually was one of the reasons.
But Father John was finishing a point. He said Subdeacon Nectarius did bring up this document, and what did he want to finish saying about that?
Well, the thing of it is evidently, I mean, we don't have access to all of ROCOR's decisions on this, but evidently there must have been something that was going on at that particular time. But if you look at the letters of Father Seraphim Rose, he talks about conciliations with the Serbs, and even talks about our bishops serving with other jurisdictions and not having any limitations put on them by ROCOR. And he did an interview with Father Andrew Kensas recently where this subject came up, and he was talking about the glorification of St. John, which I was at, although I was a layman, so I wasn't in the altar. But there was a Serbian priest who concelebrated And Father Andrew Kensas became very upset about it and asked Metropolitan Vitale about it. And Metropolitan Vitale's response was, well, that's on Archbishop Anthony. Now, I want you to consider.
I thought that he threw out that priest.
No, they did not. Yeah, and that's
and Father John, you were physically there, you're saying?
I wasn't in the altar. I was at the glorification.
You didn't see anyone thrown out, is my point.
No, but the thing is, Father Andrew wasn't even claiming that he was thrown out.
But the point is that there was discussion and problems because he was there. It wasn't like, if it was fine, this would never have come up.
Well, but this is after the time.
If it was wrong, right? It's not. They had plenty of hierarchs there. If it was wrong, it would have been dealt with right then and there.
And the thing is,
didn't know he was.
Well, the thing is, Metropolitan Vitale knew, and he said it's on Archbishop Anthony was his response. Everyone knows Metropolitan Vitale had very conservative views on this question. But the thing is, imagine if it had been a Roman Catholic union or something like that. He wouldn't have said, well, it's on Archbishop Anthony. He said, get the hell out of here. But he didn't do that because he didn't think that it was an inherently sinful thing to be celebrating with a Serbian priest, because he did it. He did it.
But wait a second. First off,
this might help me, Father Joseph. 1 second.
Hold on.
Wait 1 second. And something in Nectarios writes that if you listen to the whole interview, it was a huge problem that the Serbian priest was there. And so,
for some people, but not for most.
Well, no, this for Father Joseph. How was it a huge problem? Could you explain to the audience?
Because there was a long-standing policy that the ROCOR actually wasn't serving with the Serbs, except in a couple of dioceses that were already known for being liberal. The point is, the Serbs in general did not have a common communion, despite Father having a blessing from his bishop to do that. Most of the synod did not allow that.
Father Seraphim Rose, in his letters, he specifically mentions a meeting of the Synod of Bishops in which the subject came up, and Bishop Saba objected so strenuously to the idea of being banned from serving with the Serbs that it was not agreed upon. And this was in the 1970s.
And how many bishops were there in the synod at the time?
Well, I don't know who all was there, but the point of it is the synod was not saying at that point in the 70s, after this decree from the 60s that Subdeacon Nectarios cites,
right?
They were not agreeing that you could not celebrate with Serbian bishops.
And you yourself just stated the reason why, because Bishop Savas made such noise about it, as did Archbishop Anthony on other occasions, that Metropolitan Philaret, who did say this in his
but it wasn't just them. The point is, it was not unanimous, obviously.
That's enough, both fathers. Forgive me, but we're gonna cut this. We're gonna cut this part short.
No,
because I think we need. I think at the end, Father Joseph. At the end, it sounds to me for this impasse to be to get past it. People would have to start bringing up documents and stuff. I need to get to my filed question and move this conversation along. Because just so you know, to outsiders hearing this stuff, it's starting to get so narrow and inapplicable, no one's going to be able to follow it. So I have to keep this going in a more pointed direction. Now, in the issue of, because this started with a question of Father Joseph about whether global Orthodoxy is graceless, and he essentially said yes. I returned it to you, Father John. You essentially said, of course, no, and you went into the topic of there being these different concelebrations with clergymen. Now, being that you've been a clergyman since the late 90s, Father
1995 was when I was made a deacon.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you there.
1995 was when I became a deacon.
So you were a clergyman in ROCOR for 12 years before reconciliation with the MP.
Right.
And so it gives you a good perspective, at least at that point in time, of what was going on. And so in the 90s and 2000s, if a true Orthodox layman attended your church or other ROCOR churches you knew about, were they communed?
It would depend on which group they were with, but we certainly were communing people who were with the Synod and Resistance.
Now, let me ask this question then. Were you communing people from the OCA, the Greek Archdiocese, some of the Global Orthodox communions? Let's say, again, we're asking the clergyman who's there, so just hang on a second, Father Joseph.
Not Hockna, but definitely, because we consider them to be schismatics, but we definitely commune people from other jurisdictions without batting an eye. And I remember at a clergy gathering...
To confirm, we're talking OCA, Go Arch.
I remember this coming up at a
The new
clergy
calendar
gathering.
jurisdictions would be, so laymen from new calendar jurisdictions would be able to commune.
Right. This subject came up at a clergy gathering in Atlanta, and Bishop Gabriel, then now Archbishop Gabriel, was the one who was over. He was the functioning ruling bishop for the southern part of the diocese, at least. And the subject came up: can we commune people of other jurisdictions like the OCA? And the answer was yes. They go to confession, they can take communion. Father Constantine Fedorov was there, who got mentioned a lot in the interview with Father Andrew Kensis, because apparently he was Father Andrew's spiritual father. He was there, and he said, "But Vladika," and he started talking about. At that time, he was actually doing the service. He was doing the liturgy in a children's psychiatric hospital in Russia. And I thought that he was he was kind of out there, but I thought, well, at least he's, doing something good there. But then he started talking about, Vladika, I serve the liturgy every day, and I don't commune these children in this hospital because they're all members of the Moscow Patriarchate. So if you're going to let these people commune, how could I not let these people commune? Well, anyway, Bishop Gabriel did not revise his opinion, but that was Father Constantine's view. And it was extreme, and it was seen to be extreme by most of the clergy back then.
Okay, and I'll just add one thing, and then Father Joseph's going to have an opportunity for a comment. My confessor grew up as a Greek old calendarist, and he said that in those days when he was growing up, new calendar Greeks could come and they would commune, and vice versa. Now, I don't know if it's a Greek thing. Again, I'm a convert. I don't know all this stuff. But that's a perspective, someone on the ground, having grown up within, again, the Greek old calendarist. But he said he doesn't think that would happen anymore. And that's something I've noticed. I asked you, Father John, and also I asked my confessor, that it depends on the whim of the bishop. They didn't say there was a set policy whether or not they would commune, let's say, true Orthodox anymore at this point. But they didn't categorically say they wouldn't. You, Father John, I don't know if you want to make your opinion public on the question, but otherwise, unless you want to do that, I want to give Father Joseph a minute to respond to this, only because unless you have direct evidence of any of this stuff, because you don't have firsthand knowledge on this question.
You mean of what was going on back then?
I'm being confusing. Forgive me, guys. Forgive me, fathers. So, Father John, would you commune true Orthodox today?
I haven't been really faced with that problem. I actually have some people in my parish that used to be in the Synod of Resistance, and we have a priest that was a priest in the same synod, but they were received into ROCOR. If I had someone who was part of that group and wanted to remain part of that group, but they wanted to commune in our parish, I would probably contact the bishop and ask him. But I've just really not had that question come up.
Fair enough. So now, Father Joseph, let me give you a minute to respond before we move on to the next question, because this, Father John had firsthand knowledge of this, and but give us any insight you have, please.
Okay, I came into the church, and I originally was a catechumen in 1997. The period that you're discussing between 1986 and 2007 is one that was extremely chaotic. What Father John has neglected to mention it to you is the fact that in 1990, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, hundreds of thousands, millions of Russians actually flocked to what would be known as the Free Russian Orthodox Church, which was set up by ROCOR. And so part of the reason that a Father Constantine or anyone else would have been upset is because ROCOR had literal thousands of people all over Russia under the Free Russian Orthodox Church. These churches would eventually become the ROAC first and the RTOC later as they developed bishops and hierarchies. So the idea that in 1998, the United States, if there was somebody upset that he wasn't giving people communion who were Moscow Patriarchate, it is because the ROCOR, the Free Russian Orthodox Church, had their own churches there. They weren't supposed to be giving communion to people of the Moscow Patriarchate, but there was
that was not ROCOR policy in the United States, though.
That's because there was no frock parishes in the United States. But
we had Moscow Patriarchate people flooding the United States in that same period, and never did we tell these people, repent of Sergianism before we give you communion.
I literally watched a Moscow Patriarchate priest in Florida do the repentance service.
A priest that would have been done, but the laity, no. The laity were never asked to do that.
I don't know if that's true. I know the whole thing with, if you remember,
I never saw it.
Well, if you remember the whole thing with Father Joachim Parr and the chaos that was caused by Bishop Gabriel at the time in New York, you would understand that, in fact, the people knew, they had a popular conscience not to go to each other's churches because they knew they were either royalist or they were communist. They didn't just sit there like saying, like, I want to go to every building possible. And no offense, Father, I feel like because of the fact that you felt isolated in Texas from the other World Orthodox churches, you kind of wanted to be in communion with them. So when somebody like Bishop Anthony or
that's
Bishop
kind of no offense, Father Joseph and Father John, if you want to respond, you could, but that's kind of like a chick argument. Is it, you're saying that?
No, you're saying that
because you felt lonely.
Wait,
how's this relevant to the conversation?
Hold on, Patrick. With all due respect, a lot of true Orthodox do feel isolated, and that includes in Russia. Sometimes you'll see people put up services, and you'll have trolls from the Moscow Patriarchate go, look, your two grandmother church. People are cruel.
Well, no one's doubting that a human motivation like that could exist, but we don't want to impute that to someone. You can't read anyone's minds.
I wasn't feeling isolated. It wasn't the fact that ROCOR was, they had one parish in the Houston area. We had two Greek Old Calendar parishes in the Houston area that we were actually in communion with. What caused me to start to take a more vocal position on some of these questions is exactly the kind of stuff like what Father Konstantin Fedorov was saying. Here he was serving in a children's, not adult, children's psychiatric hospital, and he was serving the liturgy on a regular basis and refusing to commune anybody but himself. And we're talking about children.
I have no idea why he did that, and I have no idea what the hospital policy was. It's very possible that they said, as long as you don't commemorate the local MP bishop, you can't serve those children. We don't.
He didn't say that. He was saying it was his choice.
Okay.
In this meeting,
did he say? He
said,
no, well, I mean,
well, he thought that was the proper policy, is the way I should put it. He didn't say that the hospital was imposing it on him. He thought that was how a ROCOR priest should conduct himself.
Right. And all I'm saying is, if we take the underlying assumptions out, we really don't know what's happening.
Okay, and we could follow up the com box. Let me give an apology for myself and re-rent the current conversation. One, this isn't going to be Fox News, where we're going to be doing gotchas and people speaking over each other. And pretty much doing also personal attacks. This is something that, let's say, Mike Lofton did. He would let William Albrecht just start making fun of people including you, Father Joseph. And he really just didn't do his job as a moderator because the side he wanted was, saying whatever. And so I'm not going to allow that for either of you tonight. I know that, again, people don't know this is an in-house dispute. And so sometimes that gets very lively and and passions could be inflamed. And so it doesn't make Father Joseph or Father John a bad person. And so please take that into account, whoever you are, dear viewer. But that's why, if I'm going to interject, if I feel things are getting personal, that is why it's not favoritism to any side. I expect that we stick with the facts, and anything personal. Father Joseph, Father John could be the worst priest on planet Earth, but we got to take the points they're making on a factual basis and not anything personal about them. So I just want to make that very clear to reorient this conversation, and so people don't think that that's somehow unfair or that the appropriate thing to do is to have two clergymen speaking over each other. We want to avoid any appearance of impropriety and keep this based on the facts. So that's my apology for how I am running this conversation. So let me pose you a question, Father Joseph, which will be on new calendar saints like Saint Paisios. Again, not going to offend me, but this is a point that's made a lot by World Orthodox apologists. is that they have all these great saints like Saint Pisos, and essentially this looks bad for the true Orthodox because they don't accept these holy men. So respond to this however you want. Disputing their holiness is saying this is not true. It's just I want to give you the opportunity to respond to that polemic.
Okay. Well, first off, let me respond to it generally, and then let me respond to it directly with the question of Elder Paisios. Discussion of new saints. Ultimately, the question of who is establishing them. Yeah, it falls under who's the glorifying authority. I take it as basically, a priori, that if Pope John Paul II is declared blessed by the Roman Catholic Church, it is not mandatory on Orthodox to accept it. Likewise, as we don't recognize the EP, and when we're dealing with the confusion in the Orthodox world, polarizing figures who are often very problematic to us, like Anthony Bloom or Mother Maria Skobtsova, were glorified for political reasons by Constantinople, then we get accused of doing the same, of politicizing things when we glorify, say, St. Philaret of New York, who's had numbers of miracles attributed to him, has been glorified across 4 different true Orthodox jurisdictions, and so on. But if we're going to just use, just for that example, so we would ask, who's the glorifying authority? And with the case of Elder Paisios, the glorifying authority is the Patriarchate of Constantinople, who, at least on my part, I don't recognize as a particularly valid glorifying authority in the current day and age at all. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but specifically about the example of Elder Paisios of Mount Athos, I will say that there are a number of anecdotes on our side which are part of the reason why we're not into the hype machine. There is an actual Greek hype machine for Fathers Paisios, Elder Ephraim, Elder Yakovos, and the other one, the big 4 that are continually promoted with books and sometimes made up stories about them, etc. But he considered true Orthodox worthy of mockery. And more importantly, he considered ROCOR worthy of mockery, referring to ROCOR as a diseased mother when it came to your baby being sick. These are things you can look up. So, I mean, if Father John wants to recognize Elder Paisios as this great and holy man, it's the same thing as like with what's his name? Who's the priest that died? The Russian priest that died?
Father
Daniel Sisoyev.
Yeah, how did you feel about ROCOR? He thought it was schismatic. He thought it was not just schismatic, like, oh, it's a slight schism. He thought they were bad people. And he explained in long explanations why he thought they were bad people, why you were bad people.
I don't think he thought that after 2007, but his bad opinion of ROCOR probably prior to that was based mostly on the behavior of the so-called pre-Russian Orthodox Church, which I think was a big mistake.
Oh, he had plenty to say about them too. No, he was talking specifically about the Russian Church abroad, and then he stopped talking about it afterwards.
Well, last time you said that you thought that he was a true martyr and a saint. Are you walking back that decision?
Yeah, I did a lot more research.
Okay.
Let's just say I did a lot more research.
I would say that someone could still hold someone like that as saint, even if they're on the opposite side of an issue, even like that. Because I know Saint Gregory the Great called Saint John the Faster the Antichrist more than once. So we gotta be gracious with these things.
Antichrist. But anyway,
well, let me ask this question and it might end up going back to you, Father John. What do you make of old calendar saints that people don't know a lot about, like Elder Hieronymus of Aegina, Elder Kalinkos the Hesychast, or Elder Philemon of Jacob's Well? What do we make of these people? Do we recognize them as saints? What do we do with these sort of saints?
Well, Saint Philomenos, I'm not aware of him being an old calendarist per se. He was in the Jerusalem Patriarchate. And, I'd have to look at the individual case. I'll tell you what I wouldn't do, though, is I wouldn't make a statement that those people are roasting in hell. But on one of Father Joseph's shows, Bishop Enoch talked about how people in their synod were adamantly asserting that St. Paisios was frying in hell right now. And I have a hard time with that. I think St. Paisios is a saint.
Let me give Father Joseph the opportunity to respond to that, because that's a kind of emotionally charged accusation, despite it actually being said. Do you want to give an apologetic for that, Father Joseph?
Yeah, I would say, first off, he was talking about our sister synod in Greece. The truth of the matter is, like I was saying, at times there's kind of a mechanical kind of, marketing institution in place. There's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Groupthink involved, where basically if you don't agree Paisios is a saint, you're a Satanist. Now, I want to point this out. I've actually had that said to me multiple times over the past 5 years, but for some reason, Father John is mad at Greek bishops he doesn't know, who might have had a horrifying experience dealing with the fans of Elder Paisios, who might have just said, you know what, this guy's probably in hell. Look at the fruits. Like, I mean, I hate to bring that up, but that's unfortunately true on both sides. There's no way around that.
Well, you've never heard me say you were a Satanist, and
not you.
But that's not fair. Well, let me get back to these saints. So, Father Joseph, it's a common allegation that among the true Orthodox they lack like spiritual saints and spiritual elders. This came up last time. You didn't have too much response to it at that time. There's been about a year or maybe a little less since the last show, and I gave these names far in advance. Do you want to defend the notion that among the true Orthodox there's holy spiritual fathers and saints like the Athonite saints?
If I wasn't clear about that in the last debate, I did some research. Elder Hieronymus of Agina, Elder Kalinikos of the Hesychast. There's a number of other Athonite saints that are true Orthodox. Many of them are even in the Patericons of the New Calendarists that were actually zealots. Yes, they do exist. However, the reason I was not like making a big deal about it or even discussing it is because there was the problem on the other side, and this is especially promoted by people like Father Peter Heers, etc., where instead of reading the consensus of the fathers, you should only focus on the consensus of the elders. Now, that doesn't mean that Elder Hieronymus of
just to follow up, though, I don't ever remember Father Peter Heers saying we only focus on the consensus of the elders. He says consensus of saints.
And
I'm just wondering exactly what you're responding to.
Well, no, he does constantly say the consensus of saints, but then he refers to only recent glorifications by the Constantinople Patriarchate. And I would counter, Patrick, that on Twitter, when I brought this up, Orthodox Ethos came out and literally confirmed that they were talking about the consensus of recent saints, which would supposedly lead us to earlier saints. And I was saying that's not necessarily true. It can become elder cultism. And that's what I was trying to fight against last year. Only because, yes, sure, there are many true Orthodox who know true Orthodox elders and listen and pray and love true Orthodox elders. It's just not me. I work in apologetics. No one cares about Elder Paisios or Elder Hieronymus if you're a Protestant or a Roman Catholic. They're like, who are they? I have John Paul II. The point is, so you got to go to the consensus of the agreed upon fathers, and that was my original point. Not to deny that true Orthodox have elders.
Okay, so let me ask this question, and it will be back to you, Father Joseph, about the ROCOR anathemas. Something came up that they were changed. I'm not an expert in this, and all I can tell you is I remember Vladika Luke was quite pleased after Trapeza to say, and we included those anathemas against the Ecumenists. So you hear that? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, because you're very tired after that many hours in church. So do we have any more details about what happened to the ROCOR anathemas in 1983? If they've been changed, other things like that.
That's for me?
That's for you.
Yeah, they were changed after the 2000 Sabor. For the most part, they kind of combined previous anathemas that were in the Sabor's text for the Sunday of Orthodoxy already and kind of rounded out the entire anathema against Ecumenism with these other texts about Freemasonry, etc. But the one thing that they took out from the later anathema that they didn't have in the earlier one was, or those who approve, I think it's those who celebrate with them or those who regard them, something to that. I'd have to look at the text of the new anathema. But the whole point is the very thing that kind of is the line drawn, which is the heretics or their collaborators. The collaborators part was shaved off. And so ultimately it's subtle, but it does give, especially later generations who weren't aware of the original anathema, a concept that even though they might be heretics, it's okay to celebrate with them, which is exactly the opposite of the Orthodox position.
Now, Father John, we did touch on this last time. I want to give you the ability to respond to if you have any additional comments or insight into whether the documented evidence shows this is true, and then I'll have one more follow-up question.
Yeah, when it talked about those who have communion with the aforementioned heretics, it's talking about those that it's talking about these condemned heresies. But let's see if I can pull up the actual wording of the anathema here. But it's not talking about uncondemned heretics, that the people who you suspect to be being ecumenists but haven't actually been condemned. It says, those who attack the Church of Christ by teaching that Christ's church is divided into so-called branches which differ in doctrine and way of life, or that the church does not exist visibly but will be formed in the future when all branches or sects or denominations and even religions will be united into one body, and who do not distinguish the priesthood and mysteries of the church from those of the heretics, but say that the baptism and Eucharist of heretics is effectual for salvation. Therefore, those who knowingly have communion with these aforementioned heretics, and that's aforementioned heretics being the people they just referred to, or advocate, disseminate, or defend their new heresy of ecumenism under the pretext of brotherly love or the supposed unification of separated Christians, anathema. And I think when it says, the aforementioned heretics or their new heresy, it's referring to those who have communion. So again, the subject, or what's referring back to, is these ecumenists who have communion with the aforementioned heretics or who proclaim this new heresy, anathema. But then, and I believe Father Joseph has referred to Metropolitan Vitaly as Saint Vitaly, but Saint Vitaly, according to the old calendarists, said that this anathema actually was not condemning any local church.
I will, for the record, note that the glorification of Metropolitan Vitaly as a saint is that of the ROCOR A, and while there are arguments for or against, our synod hasn't made a decision on that.
Okay, but he said that it wasn't applied to anybody in particular, and that's the way anathemas and canonical penalties work. If you read the Rudder and the commentary by Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, what he says is, unless an anathema or a canonical penalty is actually imposed by a synod on a particular person or a group of people, by name, that this anathema is not directly effective to them. So in other words, it's like a speed limit sign that says you can't go above 55 miles per hour. If you go 56 miles per hour, the sign doesn't write you a ticket. The sign is a warning that you can't go above that speed limit. It's a police officer that has to write you a ticket, and then a judge that would have to enforce that ticket if you wanted to dispute it.
Well, I mean, Father John, without getting into too much detail, in the first place, I would just say that the 1986 Epistle of Metropolitan Vitaly was wrong. It was not, anathemas are not general warnings; they're condemnations of heresies.
Of heresies, but not individuals.
Well, no, not necessarily. They can be, sometimes they can be named, or sometimes they're not.
Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make is that it's not simply the same as having an enforcement mechanism. Even when there was no enforcement mechanism for Nestorius, people fled from him because he was a heretic. The idea that he wasn't a heretic until he was condemned, obviously, is ludicrous, and this can go for every heretic known in the church since the very beginning. If we have to wait for a kid to get run over, I don't think the church has that they have that kind of physical enforcement mechanism, but we can always say running a kid over is wrong.
Well, at the Third Ecumenical Council, which condemned Nestorius, he was the most devout Bishop Nestorius until he was formally condemned.
Okay, so basically, the entire argument that you're making is that the council used nice language in their accusations, whereas at the same time they were also blessing people who had broken away from him, organizing counter churches in Constantinople against him, and more importantly, then vindicating those same people who were rebelling against Nestorius the whole time in the canons of that same council. You're expecting me to believe that because of the pleasantry of an honorific, they didn't believe he was a heretic?
The council wasn't organizing people to break communion prior to
St. Cyril was.
There were individuals, and St. Cyril was certainly one of them. He was encouraging people to break communion with them, but it was not. It was certainly not a final thing. And I rather doubt that if Nestorius had baptized a child, a month prior to the Third Ecumenical Council, that people would have said, well, that child has to be rebaptized because he was baptized by a heretic.
Well, I would think that the majority of the people in Constantinople formed house churches and had priests. I don't think they would have handed their kid over to Nestorius.
Well, whatever the numbers were, there were those that did not do that. And so he certainly could have baptized a child. Now, if he had baptized a child the day after he was condemned, they would have rightly said that child was not baptized in the church.
We're getting a little off the beaten path here, but I do think both sides make a good point. Nestorius was still recognized as a bishop, but obviously he was considered a heretic
by the church
and anathematized by Cyril, and everyone considered him, a heretic, that he would go to hell. So you don't want to be anathematized. A local anathema.
He could have repented though at the Third Ecumenical Council,
but he didn't. But the whole
he could have.
But the whole point is the state recognition of him as a bishop versus the church's non-recognition of him as a bishop.
It was
two different things.
Him being referred to the most devout bishop Nestorius, that was the council that referred to him as the most devout bishop Nestorius.
And he was on trial,
and just to clarify, Father John isn't saying they're actually calling him devout. It's just a title for him being recognized as a bishop.
Well,
this is in the Acts of the Third Ecumenical Council.
I'm fully aware, but now the question becomes, are you saying, based on this honorific, that you believe Nestorius was Orthodox until the council condemnation?
I'm not saying he was Orthodox in his faith. What I'm saying is he was still a bishop of the church, one that was being diagnosed as a heretic. But
so you believe he was Orthodox until he was formally condemned?
He was still a bishop of the church until he was formally condemned. And had he baptized a baby prior to the council, they would not have rebaptized that baby.
All right, we've already gone over this, and I've already put in my 2 cents to try to sum it up. Let's change the topic, and something that you turned me on to, Father Joseph, the tangential communion prior to 2000.
Yeah.
Give us some details as to what the nature was of Jerusalem's communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, being that ROCOR's communion with Jerusalem. And you even said Greek old calendars would serve in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you just tell us, what is the nature of this intercommunion, this tangential communion? How profound was it? And how profound was it not?
I feel like it varies, and I've learned so much more since the last debate on that, in terms of the documentation. It does appear that when Jerusalem, after they were approached by Patriarch Alexis's retinue, and it was in 1945, not in 1937, as I said last year, that basically they were kind of ordered to stop all communion with the church abroad. And so they were, let me see this. Basically they were, how do I put the, I lost my brain. I lost my train of thought.
And we also lost Father John. While we're waiting for him, we have Father Peter Heers here. And I want to give,
what? Is this a joke?
Father Peter, great to have you on.
What the heck is going on?
I want to give, while we're waiting for Father John, Father Peter an opportunity to offer a clarification or confirm or deny.
Welcome.
What exactly is this thing about the elders? I haven't been following it. I've heard the accusations. Again, let's be friendly, everyone. What exactly is your view of the authority of modern day saints vis-a-vis saints in the past, I suppose?
Well, good evening, and good to see you, Father Joseph, and
nice to finally meet you,
and Patrick.
Surprised by the serpent.
Yeah. So, if we go back to the saints of the church, like Saint Simeon, the new theologian, who says that if you do not follow the saints of your own day, you will be disconnected from the saints of the previous ages.
Okay.
And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. But
And the Lord has given us in this day and age saints, and these saints are given to help us, guide us in real space and time, but also in the recent past about the situation that we're facing. And so it's unwise to ignore the consensus of contemporary saints and go back and cherry pick like Protestants from the saints of old. That's delusional. That's what we're talking about when we're criticizing that kind of approach. We're not obviously saying you can ignore the consensus of all the saints of all the ages.
Okay, well, I was never even talking about that per se. It's just that there are, as you know, many different kinds of saints. There are not simply elders. There are doctrinal teachers. There are bishops. There are holy nuns. There are, holy priests. There are martyrs, lots of martyrs, especially in our recent days. And
Sure.
we can learn a lot from the totality of those saints. Now, I was not intending to accuse you directly, but you do play a large part in promoting the culti of various elders. To me, especially having
forgive me, Father Joseph, I'm not promoting a cult of any particular elder.
It's not meant negatively. I'm not trying to attack you.
Okay. Because these are declared saints by the church, both from the people of God, like Saint Paisios, and from the hierarchy after, with many miracles, confirming with many miracles.
And I've already disputed that I don't believe Elder Paisios is the same for a number of reasons.
Let me interject, because the idea isn't to make a debate, particularly between you two. So, presuming Father Joseph
may I ask the blessing of Father John?
It's just a particular accusation was made against Father Peter, and let's be honest, everyone's having fun that this exchange is happening right now. So let's all be honest and not get all self-righteous about it. But let me ask this, though. The answer that Father Peter gave, we're not asking you to accept the saints he accepts. What I'm asking rather is the idea that we accept these modern saints and also the saints going to the past, that is a workable methodology for discerning Orthodox teaching. Yeah. Do you feel that's a satisfactory answer? And if not, what do you feel one second. What do you feel is unsatisfactory about what Father Peter is saying because he made the accusation against him?
I would say that that's a complete hermeneutic. While we may disagree upon who that consensus includes and who it doesn't include, it is a proper Orthodox definition.
Okay.
Great.
And so being that we've kind of hashed that up, my question for you, Father Joseph, is I want to give you the opportunity, if you feel there's something that's still needs to be corrected, because you have Father Peter right here, what do you feel that might still be wrong, or you don't really have any other issue anymore other than the saints that he accepts vis-a-vis the saints you accept?
Well, I think that, I'm no offense, I'm kind of on the spot here. I hadn't really thought this through. I've never spoken to Father Peter. I think I spoke to him once like 20 years ago on the phone, but it was about magazines or something. But in any case, if you could give me a couple of seconds to think about what I would say to Father Peter, if I could talk to Father Peter, because
no worries, I can wait, and you guys can go back to your conversation.
So Father Peter, I'll just be put in the background because it wasn't about that. And Father Peter, you can write in the background if you want to say any messages or whatever. But we'll get back on topic because it just seemed to me, I felt that you and Father Peter really.
I should bring it back.
I don't think your hermeneutic was actually different. So I felt by doing that we could
I still want to address some things. So let's bring him back.
Okay, wait. He's ready. He's ready for you, Father. You're back.
All right.
Okay, perfect. So we're back. You did a series, for example, on the new martyrs of the Russian Church. Obviously, my namesake, St. Joseph of Petrograd, is not recognized by the Moscow Patriarchate. Many of these saints, even recognized in the patriarchal acceptances, completely condemned the Moscow Patriarchate. They went against the idea of celebrating with them. And so my question to you is, don't you see a disconnect between people who are saying don't go to the Moscow Patriarchate when you're saying go to the Moscow Patriarchate?
Well, so did they condemn, quote unquote, the Moscow Patriarchate, or did they condemn Sergius and his ecclesiology? And and then point to the need for a council which would definitively define and resolve the matter for the church.
Well, forgive me, Father, but outside of like high education people on YouTube, I don't think any of the new martyrs were like, we need a council. That wasn't happening. That's the thing we say on the internet, but in reality, they were just saying, "Don't go to the patriarchate."
No, I disagree. I did a lot of research for that 10-week series, and I found that there were quite a few who said we have to separate because of his, and that's Canon 15, and that's a perfectly good application of Canon 15. But Canon 15, I think, can be very clearly made just on the face of Canon 15, but also looking at the new martyrs and other saints throughout history, points us to a need for conciliar resolution. Always. That's how the church always solves and overcomes heresy in every age.
Absolutely. I agree.
And so they were not doing it as an end in itself. Let's start a new jurisdiction. That was not what they were doing in 1930.
But you bring up an interesting point. It's something that I've never gotten to address with you directly, which is that unfortunately, sometimes heretics don't repent. The simple reality is that even after the Third Ecumenical Council, the Nestorians formed the Church of the East. After the Fourth Ecumenical Council, the Monophysites formed their own church. That's the key
phrase, after the councils.
Right.
That hasn't happened yet.
But
that's
now
what
we're not
That's
done.
what the saints of our day and all the ones that I've worked with in Greece for 20 years are saying needs to happen before we can definitively to call on the, and say these saints are X. This is the major problem we have with the old calendar.
Well, wait a second. What about
is that they're rushing to judge in the place and in the name of the church before the church has judged?
And
which
then
council condemned the Roman Catholics?
Make one final point, and then we got to keep going.
Which council condemned the Roman Catholics?
The Eighth Ecumenical Council under Photius. And I'll tell you, I'm happy to break that down for you, and why the church never needed a council to condemn Catholicism, because they themselves walked away from the council that their predecessors had accepted. They fell under the anathema of that council.
Hold on a second. Are you saying that the Roman
Council?
Are you saying that the Roman Catholic Church from 879 to 1054 was not Orthodox?
No, I'm saying they were Orthodox, and then their successors departed from their own popes and the condemnation of the addition to the creed, which they fell into the anathema of that council of 879. And so the church didn't need to call another council because they themselves were self-condemned, and they walked away from the church, from the communion of the church.
But based on that argument,
and there was many attempts, of course,
I think Father Joseph's making a good point here.
Wait a second. Then based on that argument, wouldn't you say that those who switched to the new calendar fell under the canonical condemnations of 1587 and 1593?
No, because
why?
Because it was not about the Manan.
That's not what it said. That's not what the text says.
No, Father Joseph, weren't those late 1500s councils regarding the Nicene canon that the Passover can't fall, the Pascha can't fall on the Passover of the Jews?
That would be a very detached and incorrect reading. What we're forgetting is that
here's what I think the point is, and I think a stronger point against the World Orthodox. So they were self-condemned, meaning the Filioquists that became the Roman Catholic Church fell into the anathema 879.
Yeah,
but here's the point that Chris Dabrowski's making. Which would mean that Father John Whiteford's argument that an anathema requires enforcement is wrong. So I think that's a strong point. I want to give Father John the opportunity to respond to that.
There was enforcement for many times over the history of the church, and the church condemned the false unions again and again, and there's been a whole consensus of 1,000 years. This is less than 100 years essentially since the beginning of you have to look at history and the way the church has dealt with things, and not operate in a vacuum and take things out of context. Go ahead.
But you're operating in a vacuum. That's absolutely what you're doing, because in the first
can we get back to the personal stuff? Father Joseph, factual point. Let me give you that, and then we got to move to the next topic.
Okay, the responses in 1587 and 1593 by the combined Orthodox Church were directly in response to Pope Gregory VII's introduction of the Gregorian calendar in 1582, just a few years before. There wasn't any mangling about the Manan or about the date of Pascha. That's all stuff that occurred after the new calendarists introduced the new calendar in full, causing riots in the streets in Romania, in Greece, and in Finland. Of course, there was no protest because they're all Lutheran. But the whole point was that the idea, and then you say, well, that's hundreds of years later. What about 879?
Well, that's not. You're misreading the condemnation. You're misreading the condemnation.
Why?
Yeah.
How?
Go ahead, Father John.
Well, the Sergian of 1583 was shown to be a forgery by no less than Metropolitan Kyprianos II of the Synod of Resistance, and he's got a very detailed treatise on the subject. So I think there was something that talked about the Pascalian that came out of a later council, but I don't recall seeing the actual text of it. Father Peter may know better.
I would like to point out that,
and just we got to give equal time to Father Joseph.
Eventually,
this again, Father, I felt we kind of buried the hatchet for the issue between Father Peter and Father Joseph. And Father Peter, you could definitely stay on, but we have to give equal time to Father Joseph.
Sure, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So the point is, when we're talking about the condemnation of the new calendar on the part of the local churches, in a 1926 edition of the Alexandrian Ecclesiastical Journal Pantanos, pages 457 and 458, the Patriarch of Alexandria was quoted as saying, quote, "The decision to change the calendar is pointless, anti-canonical, and harmful." Antioch referred to the change as, quote, "inopportune and uncertain." Jerusalem referred to the new calendar as impossible. Cyprus referred to the calendar's question to be postponed to prevent decision and schism. Patriarch Tikhon did not respond. Serbia said it would only accept the change if all the other churches adopted it as well. In 1930, in the Vatopedi Council, the Serbians refused to celebrate with the Greeks because they took the calendar change seriously. So the idea that the church was in some way united on the creation of the new calendar is horrifying. I think you even covered that.
Obviously not.
Yeah, obviously not. We agree.
One second.
Stop acting like we're the bad guys.
I want to give a little more time to Father Joseph.
No, it's the methodology you chose.
Wait, one second, everyone. Because this is actually one of the topics that we're slated to cover, which is conciliarity and the adoption of the new calendar in 1924. And so you're saying there wasn't a conciliar solution to this issue, the new calendar. It fell under previous condemnation, the Constantinopolitan synods in the late 1500s. Is there anything else on this note you want to add, Father Joseph, before I give Father John or Father Peter? I'll let them decide which one's going to respond. Address that question.
And I'm going to just say, Father Peter continues to say that that our methodology is flawed, that the old calendarist methodology is flawed. But it seems the only methodology that he'll accept is to assume that the new calendarists, the innovators, have authority, which makes no sense because they're innovators. Yeah, actually, I'll leave it. I'd like him to explain that.
Well, let me just say that the quotes that you gave about the various local churches commenting on the way on the new calendar all related to how it was introduced. It wasn't saying the new calendar was ipso facto heretical. And the thing is, if the new calendar itself and following the new calendar was heretical, that means ROCOR was heretical because they had more than one new calendar diocese. As a matter of fact, the old calendar bishops were consecrated by one of the bishops of those new calendar dioceses, which means they all were consecrated by a manifest heretic.
Father Joseph.
That's one of the most common things that is thrown out by ROCOR MP people. A bishop has a right to take in new calendar parishes. Even the ROCOR people who don't recognize the MP would be willing to admit that. That's not the central issue here. My point was that the idea that the innovating new calendarist hierarchies that began to form in the late 20s, 30s, and 40s should not have been regarded as the authorities, as Father Peter is doing. So bringing up Romanians who, by the way, they introduced it in 1925. They introduced it with the new Pascha, and it almost destroyed the country. Basically saying that they have the authority is ludicrous, and that's what I wanted an explanation for. So if we,
I want to state this because evangelos could bring receipts, and he says that the 1582 local council of Constantinople, which would determine, we would need to know exactly who subscribed to this council, but generally speaking, they would get the other synods within the Ottoman Empire to subscribe, condemned the Manian change and not just the Paschalian. I have the Greek text. So very interesting, and hopefully in the comment section, we could follow up that in the future.
But if it was heretical,
just a point
ROCOR
there.
was heretical and so forth. The bishops consecrated by ROCOR were also heretical.
I didn't say
So,
that
so
Bishop
you can't
ROCOR
say it's
were
heretical and then not say it's not heretical when ROCOR does it.
What I'm saying is that it was not respected as a calendar within the scope of ROCOR. They didn't recognize the new calendar. They allowed parishes in by economy.
They had dioceses
Now,
that were on the new
on
calendar.
a different one now, Father Peter, you've taught at Jordanville. In fact, you lived in Jordanville when I lived in Mohawk. We just never crossed paths back in the day. My question is, do you consider Philaret of New York a saint?
But I think we published. We're happy to publish the collected material by Subdeacon Nectarios by our press, and we certainly consider him a holy hierarch, and we hope to see the church, the ROCOR, and the Moscow Patriarchate glorify him in due time, and we'll see. I think the people of God tend to regard him as a saint as well. His relics are incorrupt. But guess what? I'm not the church, and neither is Father Joseph or Father John. We wait on this. This is the question of authority that I think is rightly addressed. The problem with the calendar change was mainly a question of ecclesiology and authority. It was an usurpation on the part of a few people without the conciliar and the Orthodox conciliar mind, and it should never have happened. And I think Father John would probably agree with that. A lot of us agree with
100%.
that.
Yeah.
The question is, what do we do when that happens? That's how do we respond to innovation and heresy? That's the difference of agreement, I think, with Father Joseph and the old calendars. And unfortunately, that departure from the way ends up over time becoming a departure from the truth, because these things are inseparable. And so the most egregious fruit of the departure from the way, the proper patristic response to innovation and heresy, ends up being a denial of great and holy saints in our day, to the point where they mock them and they call them pseudo saints, like Subdeacon Nectarios, who's gone off the entire
and
deep end
now we're getting
to the
personal,
right.
and again, people on
Well,
our
he's the
side
one in the
also
chat that's
say
saying
things about their
Yeah,
side.
we need to-
But
we
Father
need to
Joseph's
reference that.
here, so what's your response?
Okay, my turn.
Your Father Joseph, yes.
Okay. My response to that would be what you've described, Father, is precisely the path of falling away, which I presume you're using for the Roman Catholics. One could certainly make the argument that it was being done piecemeal with the Unia, to some degree with the old believers who entered into heresy. And ultimately, the decision must be whether it is within the true Orthodox who are throughout the world, or the people in the state churches who are throughout the world who are preserving the doctrine of the church. Now,
Exactly.
can I talk? Please don't interrupt.
I was going to ask you a question, but okay, it's fine.
You can ask in a second, because I have a point. Because we have holy saints. Many of them have they've been inserted into Constantinople's calendar under false pretenses, like Eldris Mirta Diotitiosa is one. But my point is this, that you agree that eventually one side will fall away from the previous condemnations that have been made by the church. Now, my question to you is, are there any bishops who agree with you on the issue of ecumenism outside of the Russian church abroad? Are there any bishops who agree with you that we must revert to the calendar at the synodal level? Are there any bishops who agree with you that the modernist preachers of the 20th century need to be condemned? If not, the question becomes, are we the ones falling away, or are you?
Well, there are a lot of people in the church who would definitely agree that ecumenism is a heresy. Many bishops, many clergy, many hierarchs in the old country, many abbots on Athos and all around Greece. That's the majority of the people that I spoke with and lived around and worked with for 20 years. The vast majority of the faithful and the people of God in Cyprus and Greece reject ecumenism as a heresy, reject the innovators, and so that's why I never had this gross insecurity, because I didn't have the ignorance to think that the church had fallen into delusion on a mass scale. And there are absolutely a lot of preachers of heresy today in the various local churches. It's not hard
Well,
to
final word on this exchange, Father Joseph.
Yeah, I'm going to ask because why don't the
Well, when
majority
you ask, you don't have a final word. So how about you make your point?
But Father,
It's the
Father
question. You
Peter
open the
should
can of worms.
have the final
I'm happy
word.
I'm happy to go back, and depart, because this was just a momentary thing. If you want me to stay, I'm happy to stay too.
I have a
Whatever you
question. Can you name the bishops of one synod in where the majority have spoken out against ecumenism and not individuals like Patriarch
Church
Lee
of
of
Georgia
Georgia?
condemned the branch theory and other innovations in 1997.
They actually just left the WCC. I'd have to see.
They left the WCC, and they condemned the branch theory, and they condemned other ecumenistic theories. The Church of Bulgaria
did they actually condemn ecumenism proper? Because I don't think they did.
Well, the branch theory is kind of the heart of ecumenism. I don't know. I don't remember. I didn't read the actual document in Georgian. We put it in Divine Assent in 1997 when it happened as a major event in the church. So the Church of Georgia has made clear that they don't accept the branch theory and other. I don't remember the other theories that were specified at that time. You can see it in Divine Assent, I think, second issue.
We remember Father John. He was on the show earlier today. Hi, Father John. So let me get to one of the other prepared questions, which is intercommunion between Alexandria and Antioch and the monophysites. The argument is made that there's intercommunion now between us, the Oriental Orthodox. Is this true?
Well, I can't remember if they actually, I don't think the documents actually talk about intercommunion, but there certainly are documents that talk about things like, here's what you do if a cop marries a Orthodox, and the cop's a man and the Orthodox is a woman. I know a lot of Antiochians that don't agree with that, but let's just stipulate that there are things in that are not good. It's somewhat analogous to the fact that in the 19th century, the Russian Church actually allowed for communion in extremis of Roman Catholics.
The Moscow Patriarchate.
This is the 19th century. And then the Moscow Patriarchate did the same thing for a period of time, and then later on said it was never put into effect. Now, whether it was or not, I can't say. But the thing is, you have Father Saffron Rose commenting on this and saying this is not a good thing, but the church abroad has not condemned the Moscow Patriarchate because of this. And actually, there was a quote from St. John I ran across, and I wish I could remember exactly where it was, but basically he was talking about the fact that there are things that we see in other churches that are wrong, but because our own ecclesiastical status is not firmly established, we shouldn't break communion with these people, but we should criticize them.
Father Joseph, you were on a show I did with Subdeacon Daniel Kakesh on this question, and I remember after a lot of poking and prodding, what we came down to is what the document really stated is that it traded jurisdiction. So, meaning if there was a Oriental Orthodox bishop in town, the parish became his. If there was a Eastern Orthodox bishop of town, that parish then became his. So it wasn't intercommunion. It was almost like jurisdiction swapping. Is there more to it than that? Because that's what I remember from our conversation.
Well, I mean, ultimately the question has to become whether that itself is canonical, and it's not. Deciding that a church becomes the property of a monophysite when it was consecrated by an Orthodox is nonsense. But that is, in fact, the general position. I did not want to bring up exact specific examples of monophysites communing in Antiochian churches because that's anecdotal, but they do happen, and they happen a lot. And they happen a lot more than they did 20 years ago, or I would say 30 years ago, because at the time, to his credit, the late Metropolitan Philip actually said that the things that are occurring in the Middle East in terms of intercommunion do not apply to us. But he's dead, and they do now. And so that's kind of the difficulty there, because it's not just about weddings. It's also about divine liturgy. It's about pastoral duties, holy matrimony. That is not just problematic. It is canonically untenable. It's heretical. Like, I don't
Well,
think
let me
can
add:
disagree.
is this kind of akin what was happening in Jerusalem when they were allowing these same altars to be used by Greek old calendarists, new calendarists, ROCOR, and comment on that then?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect example. In no case did the Jerusalem Patriarchate, much to my disappointment, as I learned in those early years, all the way up until the 1980s, the ROCOR nor the True Orthodox of Greece were not allowed to celebrate without the Antimentia of Jerusalem. For all intents and purposes, every ROCOR and True Orthodox Christian was on loan to the Jerusalem Patriarch. Later in the 1980s, etc., with Patriarch Diodorus, there is much more comfort in dealing with some of the True Orthodox of Greece, the Greek calendars, especially the Synod in Resistance. But by the time that became an actual possible movement in Jerusalem, the Patriarchate of Constantinople appealed to who he had to appeal to get Patriarch Diodorus deposed, and there's a question of whether he was killed, but that seems to be a question that pops up a lot. So yeah, I would say that in that case, there was at least that sense of order, because nobody disputed the councils, and everybody was basically on loan to Jerusalem.
Now, Father Peter, you lived in Greece. People in Mount Athos, the monasteries of Mount Athos condemned this agreement of Antioch.
Yes, it is.
What is the significance of this, and does it not go far enough?
Which does not go far enough?
The Athenite condemnation of the agreement between the Syriac Orthodox and the Antiochian Orthodox
does not go far enough. What else would there be on cutting off communion on the part of the Athenite?
I mean, perhaps yes. That's what I'm asking you, in your opinion, if you feel comfortable providing
everybody who works in an Orthodox manner works in a conciliar manner and understands that things have to end up in a synod if it's ever going to be addressed. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to achieve it in a human way. We have many instances in church history where not long before the Ecumenical Council that condemned the heresy, we had a massive gathering of heretics and doubling down, like the false council of Ephesus or Heres before the end of Iconoclasm, or the false councils. And so the faithful abbots and bishops that I know and work with in the old country, that's how they understand things. They understand that they're working for a conciliar condemnation and on a local level and then on an ecumenical level. And of course, if you're a Christian after St. Maximus was exiled and died in exile for 20 years, if you had the mindset of some people today on the far right, you would have lost all hope, because there was little on the historical horizon. And yet God brought about the council that condemned the heretics. This is the common trope of the zealots on the right, is that, tell us where your bishops are. How are they going to condemn themselves? Well, they could have said the same thing 20 years, going on after St. Maximus' repose. The same thing with the iconoclasts. Where are the Orthodox bishops when there were hundreds in Heres? Like, well, let's just give up and go home. This is the whole methodological problem, is we're ignorant of church history. What do we do after the first ecumenical council? We have St. Cyril of Jerusalem, we have St. Ambrose of Milan, and we have St. Meletios of Antioch, all of them in part elected by Arians, even after the first ecumenical council. And yet they were fathers of fathers, and they're celebrated to this day. And Meletios was a father of St. Basil and St. John. We have to be cognizant of church history and God's providence. And so I think that's how the fathers on Athos, they're not insecure about God's providence for the church. They're working very hard. And you have a whole spectrum of people responding in different ways on Athos. You have those who are totally compromised. You have those who are zealots on the far right, who are outside of communion among the old calendars. You have those who are non-commemorators, not with the old calendars, not commemorating Patriarch Bartholomew. There's quite a few of those that you don't know about because they don't talk about it. And then you have a lot of the monasteries that are following the holy tradition, and they're opposed to ecumenism, but they have a different methodology. And that's not surprising, because that's what you see throughout church history. You have all kinds of different responses depending on the context. Like, you wouldn't respond to the heresy of ecumenism in the church in Bulgaria or in Georgia as you would perhaps in other local churches where it's egregious. And we could go on. I don't want to dominate.
Well, okay, so let me throw two last hardballs at both sides. I'm going to go to Father John first and then to Father Joseph, and you'll see why in a second. Now, Father John, it would seem to many on the true Orthodox side that we're essentially on a precipice. The Alexandria Patriarchate has a female deacon. If I remember the news article right, they're communing Roman Catholic spouses that haven't converted to Orthodoxy, the Greek Archdiocese, whatever their Midwest jurisdiction is in Chicago, that things have reached a point that these people are flagrantly ignoring Orthodoxy. And so the accusation could be made, and you're being asked to respond to, then how could the world Orthodox rightly call themselves Orthodox when their appetite for toleration of these things seems to be borders on infinite?
Well, one thing I would say is that the Russian Church is actually not in communion right now with the Patriarch of Alexandria or the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So it's, in some sense, an issue that, unless we actually get some resolution of that, it's not quite the problem for us as it would be for other jurisdictions. But another historical analogy that I would point to is Saint Raphael Hallowini famously allowed his people to commune in Episcopal churches when there was no Orthodox church present. Now, that was wrong when he did it, but he did that because he thought, as some other Orthodox people did at the time, that the Anglicans were really Orthodox at heart, but that they just were separated by historical circumstances. Later on, he came to realize that that was not true, and he reversed what he said. But one of the complicating factors with this whole thing with the Monophysites is we did have people like Father John Romanides who promoted the whole idea that the whole Council of Chalcedon was a big misunderstanding. And so you have people who believe that because, hey, it's Father John Romanides, and he's saying it was a big misunderstanding. These people are really Orthodox. And they're wrong. And I think the Athenites were wrong to point out that this is incorrect. And I've certainly played some role in trying to point all this out. But that does provide some ambiguity to the situation that people probably that think that this is okay are probably saying, well, hey, we've already settled the fact that these people are really not heretics after all. And so this is an issue that there has to be it has to be worked out. But just like you wouldn't break communion with the Russian Church because St. Raphael Hallowini was communing or allowing his people to commune in Anglican churches, you wouldn't necessarily break communion with the Patriarch of Antioch right now, particularly when they're under severe persecution. Hopefully they resolve this. I know a lot of people who I know in the Patriarchate of Antioch here in the United States, they don't do this. They don't go along with this stuff. They're not happy about it, but it's certainly an issue, and it ought to not be an issue. I would agree with that.
May I add that,
and I'll pose the same hardball to Father Peter. What is the realistic path forward for these egregious abuses to be corrected?
Let me say, first of all, that it needs to be stated for historical truth that Father John Romanides, as I was told by Abbot George of Gregorio, when they approached him at the end of his life in 1998 and said, this is wrong, your position on the Monophysites is wrong, and they wrote a long letter to him, he accepted that he was wrong and he repented of it, according to the fathers of Gregorio Monastery. So I think that's important for the sake of all the haters on Romanides. But of course he was wrong, and that's historical reality. He was wrong. All right. So the question of the solution, there's a variety of things going on. Some of them are directly related to dogmatic error in the terms of ecclesiology, and some of them are not. Some of them are fruits of worldliness, secularization, ignorance. You have to make a distinction, and those things aren't going to be solved and are not ultimately a threat to communion. The innovations are not dealt with in the same way as an outright heretical teaching about Christ and the body of Christ. And so the innovation in the Patriarchate of Alexandria is not going to be dealt with a wholesale atomic bomb. Let's stop communion with the Patriarchate of Alexandria. That doesn't happen. It shouldn't happen. It's unwise and undiscerning. If they entered on a mass scale into communion with the papist, obviously that would be the end of that. There would be no communion any longer. And there's a discernment is necessary. I think the problem here is that that's lacking greatly in our day on all sides. The lack of proper spiritual discernment, how to deal with each case by case. We want an ideological kind of across the board answer to everything. And it usually doesn't really work that way spiritually. It's not the truth. Like, you won't be able to solve the problems if you approach things in that way. And so it's messy, it's difficult. But that's my answer to the particular innovations and teachings. I think the minimum that we all have to do as pastors is to teach and specifically counter the innovators and the innovations, and we try to do that at Orthodox Ethos in many different ways.
And we'll do plugs in just a moment. But Father Joseph, I'm going to throw a hard ball at you, which has to do with the fragmented nature of true Orthodoxy. To be perfectly frank, it's kind of confusing who's a communion with who. So, like, for example, your jurisdiction, what's your jurisdiction?
The Autonomous Orthodox Metropolia.
And are they in communion with most other true Orthodox jurisdictions or no?
They're in communion. The two major synods that they're in communion with are the Synod of Metropolitan Cherubim of Bithynia and of Lona, which is a smaller Greek synod, and the Synod of Metropolitan Seraphim of Moscow in Russia. And there are associated synods that are smaller in different countries, such as in Romania, in Ukraine, in Georgia. But they are not the large. We're probably a distant second largest true Orthodox communion, the largest one being under the GOC Kalinikos, Metropolitan Agafando of the ROCOR, and the True Orthodox of Bulgaria.
Because here's the confusion, I'd say, for the average person. It's one thing if you're already a clergyman in any of these jurisdictions, and then it becomes a matter of clergy and bishops to resolve matters. But someone who's, let's say, an atheist or Protestant, they're not Orthodox, they want to become an Orthodox Christian, due to all these eternal fragmentations within true Orthodoxy, how would you recommend to that person inquiring they would discern what is the correct true Orthodox jurisdiction to become part of?
Well, I kind of really despise the fact that I'm not able to give a theological answer on the question of how Orthodoxy is preserved, and I have to be forced into this box. But my answer is actually really simple, which is if they say they're true Orthodox, believe them and go to church with them. All of the true Orthodox, despite our divisions, know each other. This is one of the things that I learned even on the way to this debate. I have had people from different jurisdictions who have offered help, support, prayer. The idea that these disunions, that it's like Highlander or something, are all fantasies that were created by propagandists against the true Orthodox. Can I give a little statement on ecclesiology now and the stuff that?
Well, yeah, maybe this follow-up question would help then. So what you're saying is, generally speaking, because I know you wouldn't absolutely and positively endorse every single true Orthodox sect. Like there's that guy in Colorado that everyone seems to hate on.
Yeah, so, everyone in true Orthodoxy hates on him too.
Yeah, so right. So like I know you wouldn't be endorsing it, but you're saying, generally speaking, that you pick the best true Orthodox jurisdiction near you, and that the ecclesiastical and jurisdictional divisions are immaterial for the average person. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I'd say it's palace intrigue.
Now, if that being the case, because then and this will be my last hardball on this, that being the case, then how do the sort of arguments that you have to be within the canonical boundaries of the church apply anymore? Being that what you're saying is these canonical boundaries within true Orthodoxy aren't real deciding factors for, let's say, for someone to decide what jurisdiction to become part of.
Well, is Constantinople or Moscow right?
Well, the difference would be there is communion within a whole body, but there would be... So are you arguing there's tangential communion within these divided true Orthodox jurisdictions? Then please explain that.
No, I want to talk about something else. That could nope. What we're doing
Okay,
here.
well, that was my question.
Yeah.
All right,
If I
I'll let
may,
you talk about one other thing.
Yeah,
But
there's
you don't want to
literally.
answer my question.
Well, that's because of there's literally true Orthodox jurisdictions in various countries in communion with various synods throughout the world. Your question implies I need to define them all. That's unfair.
Well, but it does actually get to the
No,
point
it
of
doesn't.
the difficulty
It really
of the question
doesn't.
because it
If
can't
we
be
start
defined.
Okay, if we start talking about the canonical Church of Indonesia, that's not under Moscow or Greece or the New Calendarists in Greece. That's under us.
Mm-hmm.
So the point is, if we start playing games like every
Who's us? Under us,
the true Orthodox.
They're under the true Orthodox.
Well, but there's not one true Orthodox. There's like 10. So what do you mean?
There's actually like 15 to 25 million. But
no, jurisdictions. I mean, how many jurisdictions
are
there?
Okay, you see, this is why I say this is unfair, because a lot of things have been presented in a one-sided fashion by Father Peter, and Father John.
I'm asking you a question.
Okay, well, let Father Joseph explain it the way he wants to.
No, I want Father Peter's question.
Okay, well then, no one blame the host. Father Peter, fire away.
I'm asking a clarification. When you say under us, I'm assuming you're talking about Bishop. He's now Bishop. He was Father Daniel, right? And he went under one of the jurisdictions of the Old Calendarists.
So he went under the largest of the Greek Old Calendarist jurisdictions.
Okay, so that's what I was asking for clarification. You said us, but then there's not communion among all the different jurisdictions. It seems
not always.
To us. Well, excuse me.
Not always. No.
Right. So there's. I mean, in
are
Greece,
you in communion with are the Macedonians a real church?
Well, they're
in communion in Serbia and the rest.
Were they
of
a real church 20 years ago?
They're all in communion because they're under the Serbian church. They were received.
When was that?
But you're not just not in communion. You have serious differences, and there's
so do you. And we can do this with
there's
Ukraine
been anathemas.
And
there's been no anathemas exchanged, to my knowledge, between the local jurisdictions.
There's no anathemas that have been exchanged.
Really, in Greece, there's no. In Greece, there's no.
In general, no. There's even among the Oxentians versus the Chrysostomites, those weren't anathemas. They were depositions. So no, you're wrong.
They were defrocked, right? They were defrocked. The bishops were considered non-bishops, faceless.
And the question of whether they were canonical or not is one that we have to look at. But if you're just going to assume, they're just anathematizing each other, you're making up.
I think we should take seriously the need to actually have communion, because that's the continuation of the incarnation is in the Eucharist.
I actually agree with you. And when you're in communion with Antioch, which is in communion with Monophysites, when you're in communion with Constantinople, which recognizes the Roman Catholic Church, when you're in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, which hands off properties to Nestorians while taking them away from true Orthodox. And in communion with all the new
none of what you said actually means that we have open Eucharistic communion with those.
You don't have open Eucharistic communion with Antioch.
No, they don't have open Eucharistic communion with the Monophysites. They have they have an agreement between two patriarchs, which a number of people, bishops and clergy in the Patriarchy of Antioch, have never accepted, reject, and war and struggle against. And I was just with one of them about a month ago.
Sacrament.
And they were all struggling against those decisions. Actually, that's one of the points I want to make, is that unfortunately the whole methodology of the Old Calendars take them out of the
speaking of each other, please.
The whole methodology of the Old Calendars take them out of the struggle. They don't put them in the struggle. They take them and make them irrelevant. And they open up the whole playing field to the ecumenists so they can dominate. And instead of supporting the strugglers in the local churches, they abandon them, and then they call them, ecumenists. That's not a patristic response to heresy.
You know what? I think, let me counter by saying that I think that people fighting from within when their bishops don't agree with them are irrelevant. So maybe before knocking on the Old Calendarists, at least consider that their bishops support them. I mean, I'm sure your bishop supports you, but the point is, nobody else knows who are the anti-ecumenical bishops outside the ROCOR MP. Again, Father Peter, I asked you 3 times.
That
is just the American.
That's it's getting like Fox News again. So I'll very calmly ask: is there tangential communion within the true Orthodox communions, or is there not, Father Joseph?
Yes, there is.
Could you explain how that works?
No. Why? We know how it works.
Okay. I'm sorry. Why can't? why can't you explain it? That response
Because
confused me. I'm sorry.
Because the audience does not understand what the number of true Orthodox jurisdictions is like, and it's going to be misrepresented by the other priests on the screen.
Okay, but they're not going to have an opportunity to respond to this. So this is your opportunity to
I
explain.
haven't had an opportunity to respond to lots of things.
Well, you're given an opportunity right now. And so
specific question.
So here's why. Here's why, Father Joseph, because he said, well, there's the schism between Moscow and Constantinople, right? But this could be addressed. Yes, Moscow and Constantinople are not in communion.
Alexandria.
But yes, but the point is, Moscow's, let's say, in communion with the OCA, who's in communion with all those people, right? So there's a very there's a very easy to delineate tangential communion there. So my question is, do we have similar examples within true Orthodoxy, or are they totally walled off from each other? I think that's a fair question.
And I've repeatedly said, no, they're not walled off from each other, and you're asking for specific examples of specific
like I just gave an example. So we have examples of those tangential communions.
Okay, so like, for example, the ROCOR under Archbishop Andronic and Metropolitan Demetrius of the GOCK, because they were in communion, still remain in some level of communion, even though formally the ROCOR does not recognize Archbishop Agafungal because of what he did and wanted to call him to trial. Does that help?
And so probably. Let me just help me. So what is the third party that both sides are in communion with? Because that's what's needed for tangential communion.
The GOC Kalinikos, which is in communion with the ROCOR under Metropolitan Agafungal, and some level of intercommunion and intercooperation with the ROCOR, which is not under Agafungal.
Got it. All right, thank you. That's our one to tease out.
And they're also in communion with the Serbian True Orthodox, who are not in communion with anyone else.
So now that we've covered all these topics, we're going to be doing audience questions. But first, I want to give everyone on the panel an opportunity to do some plugs. I will go because with Father Joseph first, we have your website linked below. Give some plugs, please, Father Joseph.
Some plugs. There were a few things I wanted to address. There's my again, my website and my YouTube channel. It's a shame that we didn't get to address, even for 2 minutes, questions about the different problems within the World Orthodox hierarchies. We didn't deal with the fact that Father Peter's methodology is consistent, but it also demonstrates that his communion is likely the one that will not be Orthodox in the future. And I didn't get to defend a bunch of saints who got thrown under the bus, like Saint Raphael, Saint Augustine indirectly, because Romanitas repenting is ironically what most Romanitas accuse Saint Augustine of not doing. But yeah, I have a website. I have a YouTube. And on my YouTube, this is cool. On my YouTube, if you go to the homepage, there's dozens of true Orthodox YouTube websites. So if you want to see true Orthodox material from all over the world, whether Russia, Bulgaria, Greece, or other countries, or just some cool American guys like me, you can just go to the homepage at NFTU's YouTube website. And with that,
thank you for that passionate plug.
Unless I can get one quote.
Well, we're not done after this. We're going to have audience questions, and we'll get to I like that idea about World Orthodox hierarchy, so I'll let you address that when we're done with plugs. Father John, any plugs?
Well, I have a blog, Father spelled out john.blogspot.com, and the parish website is saintspelledoutjonah.org. I would suggest giving Father Joseph 5 minutes to address whatever issues he wants to, because obviously, I know that Father Peter came on because my internet died on me briefly, and I don't want it to be perceived that Father Joseph is not given a chance to say whatever he wants to say. But let me just preface it by saying I didn't throw Saint Rafaelini under the bus. I just stated the fact of what happened, and he acknowledged that he made an error. But Father,
he put an encyclical correcting it.
We'll graciously give Father Joseph that time. I'll also give the recommendation, Father Joseph, like I already did, don't ask other people questions, because then they respond to you and then you feel like you weren't given as much time. Just make your point and
Well, it's
don't
just
ask questions for
dialogue
people to
goes
respond to
back
you.
and forth with my thinking. But anyway, fine. That's fine. That's fine.
Father Peter, because you're gracious enough to jump on and have fun with us tonight, please give us your plugs.
I don't really have many plugs. People can just Google my name and Orthodox Ethos, and they can find. We have a lot of things going on, publishing and social media. I'm just happy to plug Father John, because I think his blog and his wisdom over the years has been extremely beneficial to me and to a lot of people. So that's all I have to say.
I'll do a plug for not only just Orthodox Ethos, but Uncut Mountain Press, because I especially think this book they publish is very good. The Rise and Fall of the Papacy.
It is an excellent book.
So
It is
check that out. I think everyone in the panel approves of it. So that's the one thing we all have in common is the Rise and Fall of the Papacy. I will also plug that if you want to make programming like this possible, like and subscribe and share. And also, please be the reason why successful missionary work is occurring in Cambodia. Consider becoming a missionary, or if you can't, support financially the missionary work in Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Link is below. So, Father Joseph, it's 9:20 Eastern Standard Time. Please take 5 minutes to say whatever you like. We would like to be able to give you a closing statement so you can have the last word.
Okay, well, this is a closing statement, I guess, and before we go to any questions or anything, I wanted to point out, and again, when we start talking about the methodology of how to determine who is breaking from the church, I think Father Peter was absolutely correct, even if he was incomplete, but I think he'd agree that what I'm going to say is correct. The methodology for that is either conciliar condemnation or falling away due to a previous conciliar condemnation, such as in the case of the Roman Catholics. Because of that, we now have to analyze in the present moment, as I mentioned, with the Fourth Council, with the Monophysites, with Antioch, with mixed marriages and some intercommunion, though he doesn't seem aware of it. We have to deal with the fact that Constantinople recognizes the Pope of Rome as first in the taxis and has for the past 60 to 70 years. We have to recognize the work that the MP is doing with the Church of the East. The historians, although this is to some degree motivated by Russian interests in India, we have to deal with all the people who are on the new calendar that was condemned by the 1587 and 1593 councils. And we have to deal with people in the OCA, for example, bishops who reject the Fifth Ecumenical Council and think Origen's a saint. All of these things, especially because of tangential or correct communion, have to work together. And what it means, if we're using that methodology to stick around and stick with what we call the official church when they are obviously falling away from orthodoxy, means that if we were to apply this hermeneutic to true orthodoxy and world orthodoxy, on the true orthodox side, you have a bunch of people bickering like children. And on the world orthodox side, you have a bunch of people surviving heretics and heretical bishops. Gervasius Paraskevopoulos of Patras, I believe he's considered a saint, he was well quoted as saying, "For the time being, we will obey these innovators, remaining on guard for subsequent changes." That sort of implies that unlike Canon 15 of the First Second Synod, where we're told to flee innovators, that Elder Gervasios was pointing for people to stay with them. This was even addressed on Mount Athos. Father Peter mentioned the extreme zealots. I assume he's talking about Esphigmenu, the people who have been tortured and mistreated by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, where they've tried to send the Greek government in, and like 30 monks have died since the 1970s. These confessors, whose biggest crime is not using UPC symbols, is basically like, they're basically not only treated as irrelevant, but they're being evicted. If we look at what Elder Savas of Mount Athos said about that, when he says, "Could Elder Paisios and the 70 bishops of the state church of Greece be in error?" And he says, do you want God to force him to confess him? And that's kind of what I feel like a lot of the people fighting from within are doing. That it's testing God. When we know there are true Orthodox bishops all over the place, hundreds all over the world, many of them have beautiful monasteries, etc., right here in America, and have good administrations. They're not perfect. They're human. They're fallen men. But at the very least, that they are interested in preserving the true faith. We have to take them seriously. And the fact that they keep getting dismissed and name-called is just shameful to me. Since I've got a minute, I want to mention this. One time I actually called Father John when I was living in Russia. And I had gone to the Artbats, the ROAC, and we were talking about our differing views on Metropolitan Valentine. But I would go every Sunday not every Sunday, probably once a month, I would go to Suzdal. And the Tsar Constantine Cathedral was there. And every Sunday that I went, there were hundreds of people in this church, young people, old people. It was joyous and it was raucous and it was beautiful and it was the most wonderful thing. And people are wondering, why is he bringing up his memories of the Tsar Constantine Cathedral? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because in many cases you read about true Orthodoxy in the time of the Soviets, and their churches were taken away from them and the people were persecuted and put in jail. And what does that have to do with me, an American in 2005, going to a church in Suzdal in Russia? Well, I came back to America in 2006, and in 2009, the state, at the request of the Moscow Patriarchate, took that church away, locked that church away. They did not hand it to the Moscow Patriarchate for the benefit of the people, because the MP people of Suzdal needed worshipers. It was converted to a tourist site where you get to pay to have entrance to see the empty church. Now, explain to me how these same people who can destroy churches where there were hundreds of confessing Orthodox Christians, close it down, have the same gall to hand over churches to Nestorian heretics. And that was just last year. Eventually, we have to ask, just like Father Peter says, who fell off? But I think the answer is going to surprise you when you think about it and look at it. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
And my comments would be that I've read that the Moscow Patriarchate has, with the lands that Russia has taken during the war with Ukraine, has forcefully turned parishes that were in OCU back to them. And so a lot of these heavy-handed, and people could argue and justify it. My point's not even to critique it. It's just that it tends to be heavy-handed tactics tend to come back. And so that has now happened to the canonical church in Ukraine that's in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, where the OCU is now doing that, has been doing that to them for years. But it's not that this started with the OCU. These sort of tactics have been occurring for years. Under Stalin, they did it to the Unions, and they forcefully converted them to Eastern Orthodoxy. And so what we're seeing, just so people are aware, without any bias, is heavy-handed tactics tend to come back at you eventually. You could justify them all you want, but that's what occurs. And so some of the persecutions that Orthodox experience today, in some respects, could be the result of persecutions they were part and parcel with in the past. So that's my 2 cents on that question. We're going to get to some audience questions. And we have, I want to go down to a couple of these first. 1 second. We have, for Father Peter, as a true Orthodox, there's a lot of respect of you popping on here tonight. God willing, you'll be open to something like this again in the near future. And even ask for your blessing, Father bless. So thank you for coming on, Father Peter. One person in the audience showing appreciation, because a lot of other people saw this. This stuff ruins people, all this bickering back and forth, but yet all are Orthodox. May God help us. And so that's why I try to be a somewhat aggressive moderator, try to prevent this bickering, because the optics of it are not good, and it's not edifying sometimes. So where I've fallen short, please forgive me, and please help people understand I'm going to hear from both sides. That I wasn't fair to the true Orthodox or I'm LARPing true Orthodox or something like that. And what I'm trying to do is keep things civil. So there's that point there. We have a question for Father Peter. I purchased the Acts 879. When are they coming out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, please forgive us. Please forgive us. Way late. We overestimated our own ability, but we wanted to make this the very, very best publication. We didn't consider the additions, and they kept coming. So we've added appendices, we've added footnotes, we've translated. I mean, what I want to say is you're going to get a very good publication, and it's at the printer. We've sent it to the printer, and so now it's a matter of, and we're doing a very beautiful hardcover edition, and it'll come
how
out.
How large is the printing, Father?
I think we're at, if I remember correctly, 500 pages.
But I mean, how many copies is your original?
Oh, we're going to do 1,000, which is a lot for us and for this particular book, because it's a hardcover and it's a beautiful edition, which, you know, we're not usually able to do because we just want to bring books out. So we try to bring them out quickly. And so this time, though, we're going to put a lot of investment into to make it really a great publication. But what I want to stress is that we've added the commentary of Blessed Dositheus of Jerusalem, his introduction. We've added a lot of commentary from the contemporary editor of the edition of the Acts of the Eighth Ecumenical Council, Constantine Simakis, and then we have also very extensive index. So we've worked very hard to make this a very memorable and hopefully perennial publication. And I think it's extremely important that all of us Orthodox understand the significance of the Council of 879 and St. Photius and what it means for the history of the Church and for Catholicism. It totally is a game changer in the sense of the narrative that's been put out there and accepted by a lot of Orthodox is that, well, it started in 1054, but we're not really sure when it ended, and that's just not historically accurate. So there's a ton of things there that are going to be helpful to the Church. But anyway, it should be out in a month. The answer is a month and a half. Hopefully by the end of February, it'll be in circulation. It depends on how quickly they can turn around the printer. So
I have my conference copy. I look forward to a copy with all the footnotes. We have a question that's for all three, but I'm going to address it just to Father John, which is, how does one go about stop using people and thinking of people as objects? I'm struggling with this as a former atheist. So what's your pastoral advice to this random question, Father?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to answer the question without getting more details as to what exactly they have in mind. But I think the key is that you have to choose to love people, and loving is a matter of how you act towards people. It's not even how you feel. How you feel may come along, but for example, let's say that you have a wife that you're treating like an object. Well, you need to stop doing that and choosing to love her. And so what you need to ask yourself is what I'm doing loving my wife or not? And if it's not, then you need to stop that. And I think that if you're acting in a loving way towards people, particularly someone who's close to you, like your wife, that you should have affection for, the affection will come eventually, but the behavior is what you have to do, whether you have the affection or not.
Yes, I would say that interpersonal guidelines are very important. Not going by feelings. Feelings are very easily deceived. They deceive us. Now, we have this from Oriental Orthodox, World Orthodox one, True Orthodox one. I want to see how many say the opposite side, that they're on one, which I think speaks to, I feel, the unbiased nature of this exchange, that this is not clear. We have this from Seraphim Webster: this string is enough for me to become true Orthodox. So despite with these three World Orthodox people here, this person felt that they got the information to make that decision. So I feel, again, to shield myself from claims of bias, but I also want to make an apology for, because again, I'm a layman in ROCOR, that I'm not an expert on this question. My intent in this conversation was to bring out as much information on all sides of this question and let everyone and be tough on everyone. So if you think I've been tough on your sides, because I was tough on everyone in this show, besides maybe Father Peter, because we were even planning you coming on. This came on, so you got the guest treatment. We have this from Manuel. Craig brings Jeannie Constantino, and she starts saying phronema 3,000 times. Absolutely not, because women have no business teaching theology publicly to the church. So I'll leave it at that, because someone has to say it. I don't know why that's even controversial. I think St. Paul is controversial, maybe, but there we go. We have this, and this is for Father John Whiteford to respond to. Father John Whiteford strains the gnat of ecclesiastical technicalities and swallows the camel of Armenian communion with uncondemned heretics. So what's your response to this, Father John?
Well, the thing is you can only talk about that if you're saying, well, you're in communion with someone who's in communion with someone who's in communion with, because my bishop's not a heretic. I don't think the Russian church is heretical. And, there are there ever things that happen within the Russian church that are objectionable? I'm sure that there are, but the position of the Russian church is not heretical. But there are things in various local churches that do need to be criticized. But earlier, Father Joseph had mentioned that Canon 15 says we should break communion with innovators. Actually, it does not. It talks about breaking communion with heretics. Someone could break the canon. Someone could, and I think introducing the new calendar was a violation of canonical order. But it was not a basis for breaking communion because it wasn't a heresy.
Yes.
But
let me push back a little bit. And that would be, but is that the historical ROCOR position?
I don't know. It definitely is a historical ROCOR position because, like I said, we had at least 2 new calendar dioceses. I think we might have even had 3. But it wasn't just we allowed a parish or 2 to be on the new calendar. We had bishops that were serving on the new calendar.
There were literal bishops of the synod, even if it was not a full synod declaration, who flatly wrote to True Orthodox in Greece saying, we know that the new calendar is a soul-destroying innovation. To imply that they all endorse it is ridiculous.
Well, I don't think anyone said the word endorsed, Father Joseph.
Yeah, you came close.
No,
and I'd like to push back.
Let's be real charitable, not Loftonian charitable.
Well, I just want to push back.
Not put words in people's mouth. I think that'd be fair.
Well, I think we're putting words in people's mouths when we say the ROCOR bishop supported the new calendar. But my point is that I know the fathers here disagree because they're trying to say that Canon 15 didn't apply with the calendar change, but the calendar change was motivated by joint celebration with the Anglicans. None of us here have not read the 1920 encyclical, so it's disingenuous to separate that from the purpose of the calendar change.
They didn't innovate on those ways in 1920 or 23. They made a change in the calendar. You don't respond to what they might do, or they're hoping a minority might want to do in the future.
But you are admitting that they were violating what was decided in the Church of Greece in 1587 and 1593, correct?
They're innovating, yes. We've already established that. I mean, I wrote a book on this. You can go read it, Missionary Origins of Modern Ecumenism. I talk about that. I talk about the egregious innovations of the 3 patriarchs of Constantinople in the 1920, 23, 24, recognizing the living church in Russia. I mean, this is all common knowledge. Again, the question is not, do we understand the problem? How do we solve it? How do we heal it?
It's worth noting that until there were bishops in the True Orthodox Church of Greece, which would be 1935, a series of joint communiques came out from various of the local churches recognizing Anglican orders. I mean, the whole point is there was a trajectory to this.
How did that do over time?
I don't know. I know that there's Anglicans who are recognized by some of the orders.
We don't have any recognition of Anglican
orders. You don't know that's
today.
true. You can't speak for everybody.
We don't have any official recognition of Anglican orders.
I don't know.
In local churches?
Not sure on that. I'm not sure. I feel
Father Joseph, do you have a single example of a bishop recognizing the communion of Anglicans?
No, I don't, and I'm not going to say today. I'm not going to say that they do today.
And leave a comment if you find it. We have this comment. The Alexandria Patriarchate signed agreement with the cops saying they must allow mixed marriages. So, don't know the details, but that Sava the Saint is bringing it up. We have Calcio. Yes, Georgia did condemn ecumenism. Gregory De Capoliti has the whole statement in the video up on his channel. So if people want to read it, they could go to that channel because he has the videos of the words, kind of scroll down the music. So you have that option. We got a fastball to Father Peter by Chris. Father Peter's argument is that the only way to be united to the truth is to take communion from a bishop who prays with Roman Catholics, Presbyterians, and Monophysites. Your response to that?
It's a total straw man. I never said anything like that. And I don't support the idea that you're, first of all,
but answer the question.
Yeah, I will.
Well, it wasn't a question, it was a point, and he's being given out to do that.
Right, but you have to.
Father Joseph, let Father Peter go.
Does it happen or not?
Does it
Stop
happen?
talking.
Wait a minute. Do people have positions that are heretical in the church today? Is that what you're asking?
Was that the question?
Can you put the question back up? Is it far?
There. I clicked the star away and it's gone away, but he pretty much said the only way to have the Orthodox truth, he was
take communion from people who do these things, yeah.
Would be to have to take communion from someone who prays with Roman Catholics and recognizes monophysics.
The church encourages and blesses and supports and praises in Canon 15 someone who will stand and either their own bishop or their patriarch if they're a bishop, and for a heresy that's been condemned, they separate from them, but all is meant to lead to a conciliar decision. And so the church in that canon does not punish them for not doing it, and does not have any kind of canonical punishment for anybody who does not. So clearly,
what does it say about
canonical? Let me finish, Father Joseph. There's no canonical basis to consider those who do not flee a preacher of heresy from the church and break communion with everyone who's in communion with him. All of that whole theory reminds us of like a legalistic Protestant vision of the church. There's no basis for that kind of what they call in Greek the kinununda dohia, the communing vessels, basically. This thing what Father John says, you're in communion with so-and-so, communion with so-and-so. It praises the person who, for their own bishop, will walk away or cease communion or commemoration for their own bishop, not for every bishop on the face of the earth, not for the local churches all around the world. And it presupposes that the church remains within its canonical order in its fight against heresy, and it doesn't become the Wild West. And that all the actions of the saints over the ages have been measured and discerning to lead the church to a conciliar condemnation of heresy. And that's not what has happened among the various Old Calendar's jurisdictions. And in fact, they demand that you cease and walk away, not only from the preacher of heresy, but from all bishops on the face of the earth who might be in communion with that person before conciliar condemnation. That's not cannot. And Saint Nicodemus talks about this, that that the canons are not automatically applied. And St. Nicodemus also says, if you think that someone who is teaching heresy will still be able to repent, do not immediately call him out and depart from him. So there's obviously a understanding of the need for discernment and the need for working together with the Orthodox. The most egregious problem here is that they not only break and flee from those preaching heresy, which is supported only for the bishop of the preacher of heresy, but they break from all the Orthodox around the earth. So this person it's a straw man, what the man was asking.
Yeah, to be fair, I don't think it was a serious question. It was not a serious question. So, but that being said, we have this. Cobleskill has a lot of miracles happening from Elder Joachim of Mount Athos. Father Joseph, do you have any comment on that?
I kind of wanted to respond to Father Pete.
But that wasn't addressed to you, so we got to keep it moving. We're at 2 hours and 40 minutes, Father Joseph.
He was responding to me, and he was presenting a lot of false arguments.
I didn't respond to
a lot of these are addressed in this show.
5-minute monologue. I wanted to respond to a lot, but I didn't.
I didn't have a 5-minute monologue. I spoke for 2 minutes, asked one question, and you answered for 10.
That being said, no comment on. All right, so someone else have to comment on what's.
I haven't been to Cobleskill yet. It's beautiful. Lots of people love it. There, great.
Okay, be that as it may. We have stop placating the talking points about Sergianism after the Living Church Schism. Metropolitan Sergius was received by St. Tikhon. St. Tikhon issued a letter of loyalty to the Bolsheviks. Do you have a response to this, Father Joseph?
Yeah, a lot of that Soviet forgery. Cue Father John.
All right, so Father Joseph thinks it's a forgery. We have, is a true Orthodox baptism valid, Father John?
Well, it depends on what you mean by valid, but because
Would
you know,
ROCOR rebaptize someone that has a true Orthodox baptism?
I don't think so. I'd have to ask the bishop about it, but I don't think so.
Okay, we have this. GOCK also loves Sergianism. They willingly signed in 2014 their legal status as other sectarian groups. Is that Sergianism, Father Joseph?
No, and they did that to protect whatever legal status they had because of the fact that the Constitution of Greece includes a definition of the church, and the whole point is it was leading to lawsuits on the part of the new calendarists. That's why they created the new law.
And what's still happening? Whatever happened to the old Greek old calendarist monastery on Athos? And are they totally kicked out by now? What's the persecution of that group?
No, as Fragmented is still there. There's still over 100 monks there, despite the ecumenical patriarch and all the supporters of the false traditionalists trying to kill them. They're still there. And you can link to Friends of Esfigmenu on my homepage.
There we go. We have, did Empress Catherine invite Muslims into Kazakhstan, Father John?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, anyone know the answer to this question? Stuff like this could happen, by the way, because they're trying to get people that could act as like buffer states, so to say, but this wouldn't be something in the Orthodox Church, obviously.
Tsar Nicholas did give out copies of the Quran to Muslim soldiers in World War I. I know that.
There we go. Tsar Nicholas II. We have why is the OCU schismatic and graceless, but the MP, which had similar origins, collaboration with the godless state, renovation of persecution Christians, is not? So Yaya Maria wants to ask you that, Father John.
Well, the Moscow Patriarchate was not composed of bishops that were self-ordained or ordained by people who had been deposed. And the Ukrainian church was, like Epiphany, the current head of it, was consecrated as a bishop by someone who had been anathematized and excommunicated by the Russian church, and this was recognized by everybody in the church at the time.
And he's not self-ordained.
Well, Epiphany it was not ordained by a canonical bishop. Now,
but he said self-ordained.
Well, there's one other guy, I think, in the catacomb church. I
there are
think Father
bishops
John's
in the
referring
second
to.
group that were
You're talking about the dead hand Ukrainians, and none of them have any lineages now, Father Peter. God, this is boring.
What?
This is like you guys are making stuff up. I shut up, and then you talk and make stuff up. Like you just dishonored Canon 15 of the first second. I'm bored.
Well, Father Joseph, I would say just calm down a little bit because you're not helping your side with that. That being said, Calcius says, never forget when Akafangel from Roka turned in Roka Adronik parish in Kazakhstan to the authorities. Did that occur?
I've never heard of that.
I don't know the details of that either.
Okay. We have, why do you ban people from the chat, Craig? Tell us why. And again, it's to try to keep as civil of atmosphere as possible that I could do while having limited computer abilities. So thank you. We have, Craig, I like your hat. It is a nice hat. Thank you. Some way, this is Chris Dabrowski, some way forward with the Soviet government involved handing over millions of Orthodox Christians to their deaths. I'm legitimately shocked that Father John is taking this position. So, Father John, your response?
Well, any bishop that actually handed over anyone to their death, obviously that was a horrible sin. I'm not sure that you could say that everybody in the Moscow Patriarchate did that. So, I mean, you'd have to look at the accusations and see. This gets back to, as I mentioned, the lapse or the traditors after the persecutions by Rome. the whole Donatist controversy was about a bishop that was accused of having been guilty of that. He denied it. And that's somewhat analogous to some of the accusations against bishops in Russia. The church decided, however, that whether a bishop is worthy or not, it doesn't have any effect on the sacraments. And so a bishop could be a horrible person and still have valid sacraments, nevertheless. And one other thing I would say, just generally speaking, is it's very easy for people in the United States to be armchair confessors and talk about what people in the Soviet Union did. But it's another story when you're talking about people who actually had to face very difficult situations. I've told this story before, but for those who haven't heard it, I think it was in 2003, we had an all diaspora clergy conference. And I think it was Father Roman Lukianov of Boston that got up and told a story about a priest in Russia who was being interrogated, and they were trying to get him to sign a denunciation of people who were already condemned and imprisoned. And he said, I'm not going to sign it because it's not true. And they said, well, tomorrow you're going to sign it. And then the next day they brought in his son and started breaking his fingers. And he signed it. Well, it's easy to say, well, he shouldn't have signed that. And he's going to have to answer to God for what he did. But you know what? I'm not in a position to judge a person like that, because I can't say that if my daughter's hands were being broken in front of me and I was signing a condemnation of people who were already in prison and everybody knew it was a lie, that I wouldn't do that to stop my daughter's fingers from being broken. Now, if I was being asked to deny the faith, I would not do that regardless of what was being done. But that's the kind of things that people were faced with. And I think that maybe a little bit of charity is in order, because as I said, St. John was very charitable about Metropolitan Sergius, and this was not just when he was in Shanghai and was commemorating Patriarch Alexis I. He wrote a history of the Russian Church abroad. You can read it online, and he gives a very charitable interpretation of Metropolitan Sergius's action. And this was written, I believe, in the 60s.
Well, let me give Father Joseph, because that point has come up a few times, let me give Father Joseph an opportunity to respond a final time on that point, to correct the record if he feels whether that's true about St. John Maximovich.
Again, St. John did repent of joining the Moscow Patriarchate. I'm shocked right now. I'm actually in a state of real discontent. The bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate were responsible for the deaths of thousands of clergy. They took part in the capture, the torture, and the death of what would eventually be 27 million Orthodox Christians. I can totally understand someone signing a document because their kid's fingers are being broken. I can't understand reporting someone to their death in the hundreds, the thousands, and ultimately the millions. This is, again, I expected equivocation, not to this level. That's kind of why I'm somewhat distraught.
Well, if you have evidence that a bishop actually did that, I'd like to see it. And if they did it,
you can throw it away?
No.
Yeah, look, the Mitrican
I've not seen any evidence that bishops said, "Hey, kill these people." But there is a lot of evidence that bishops had a role in killing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of old believers. And the old believers were still schismatics, according to the text.
There's no evidence of what you're saying, and more importantly,
no evidence of old believers being killed with the cooperation of the church.
No evidence of bishops signing off on bunches of old believers that are open documents. No, they don't have that. And for more importantly, the fact that you keep defending the whole Soviet old believers thing, even Metropolitan St. Philaret was like, why is Solzhenitsyn defending the old believers? They were doing it at the beginning because the old believers helped the Soviets. They helped kill the other people because they hated the Tsar. This is so old, man.
All right, well, we have two more questions because I think everyone's getting tired and cranky. I know I am. So we have Father Joseph. What are the opinions of the old calendarists when ROCOR Western Rite operates on the Roman calendar? I know that you are Western Rite, if I believe, right?
I'm not.
So
I'm not Western Rite, and have not been Western Rite since I was ordained a priest.
Oh, I'm confused. But what's your answer to this question then?
Father Joseph, what are the opinions of old calendarists when ROCOR Western Rites op? Most old calendarists don't like the Western Rite, just like most new calendarists don't like the Western Rite. That's my opinion.
Okay, and
on the question of the old believers, I just remembered one bit of evidence that what I said is true, and that's both the Moscow Patriarchate and ROCOR wrote letters of apologies to the old believers because of their role in the persecution of the old believers. So to say that there's no evidence that it's true is just false. I mean, both churches, when they were not in communion, separately apologized to the old believers. As a matter of fact, our church, in their apology, said that perhaps the persecution of the Russian church under the Bolsheviks was God's punishment on the Russian church for what they did to the old believers.
Final word on this question to Father Joseph.
Yeah, in the case of the Moscow Patriarchate, that was an increasing change in policy that had been going on since the revolution, because the Edinovari sided with the Bolsheviks. In the case of what happened in the 1970s with the legalization of the old Rite and ROCOR, that was because of the influence of people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who argued that there were no true Orthodox left in Russia, even though we know now that that wasn't true. So yes, you can say that there was some work to help the old believers out. And look, I'm not going to just straight out condemn the Edinovari, but I don't care. The Edinovari were acting in a way that was contrary to the rest of the church until they finally realized they had no priest and didn't want to become a bunch of priestless heretics. That's
all right. Final question, and we're going to call it an evening. What does Father John think of the Moscow Patriarchate praising Sergius and calling him a confessor? I don't know how popular this is. So your comments on this, Father John.
Well, you can't say that the Russian church has praised Sergius and called him a confessor. There are some individuals that have done that. And the thing is, like I said, St. John had a somewhat sympathetic perspective on Metropolitan Sergius. I think that he was a weak man, and I think that that's the reason why the Moscow Patriarchate eliminated all the people who could have taken that role until they got to him. But, if someone wants to say, well, he wasn't all bad, I don't think that I think it's probably not spiritually beneficial for us to spend a lot of time judging him personally. I think we certainly can say that any bishop or priest or layman, for that matter, that actively participated in helping the Soviets persecute somebody or certainly have them killed, that was a sin, and that shouldn't have happened.
It's as the kind of, again, I'm the novice with this stuff. I'm under the impression when I read all ROCOR stuff or like the website Orthodox Info, Sergius has an ism named after him, and it does seem that the ethos of how ROCOR deals with the Sergius question has changed if you just read old internet stuff versus new internet stuff. But perhaps this stuff is numerically misrepresented, and it depends on the website. But that is something I'm under the impression that if there was a serious push to, for whatever reason, canonize Sergius, that it would lead to another schism with ROCOR. But
I don't think that it would happen. But Craig, before we shut down the show, could we go ahead and do closing statements, even if it was just maybe 3 minutes?
Well, I'll give everyone a closing statement, but first, Father Peter, you haven't talked in a while, so I'm going to be very strict to this. 3 minutes closing statement, Father Peter.
Oh, you put me on the spot here. Okay.
And you could cede your minutes.
Well, there's a lot to address. I don't know where to start. I mean, I've been thinking about commenting on the quote by St. Gervasios of Patra, which has been thrown out many times in the chats, and I think Father Joseph mentioned it. And I don't remember the quote now in front of me, but it was basically, he was talking about innovators. And this is an important distinction that is clearly made in the canons as well. One thing to be an innovator, another to be preaching heresy, bald-headed, bareheaded, and that heresy having been already condemned by the church fathers and the councils, which is what Canon 15 says. So St. Gervasios is not alone among many holy men of the 20th century who had the discernment to understand the difference between an innovation and worldliness and secularization and the infiltration of secular ideas and outright heresy with regard to Christology or ecclesiology. I think that's a basic point that's lost, and there are many people who are fed up with all the secularization and worldliness in certain parishes, and they end up going to the old calendarists to flee that. I've talked to many young ladies and others who come over from the old country, and they say, well, this old calendar parish looks a lot like my parish in Greece, whereas the GOA parish looks like, something else. I'm not at peace. And that's totally understandable, but that's one thing. And heresy, dogmatic error is quite another. And the canons do not address how we should respond and do not demand or require us to respond in a particular way to innovations. You can't find a canon or any canonical basis for saying break communion because there are innovations. There's a variety of medicines for a variety of sicknesses in the church. And if we take one scalpel and we try to solve all the problems in the church by cutting people open, you're going to have a bloody mess. And that's what old calendarist jurisdictions have become. And they don't solve the problem. That's my biggest complaint. They don't solve any problem. They make it harder and worse in many places to actually overcome the heresy and preachers of heresy. So the proof is in the fruit of the methodology. And I think that a lot of people in ROCOR over the years understood that experientially. They wanted to support the traditional minded Orthodox in Greece, and they got very involved in doing that for about 2 decades, and then they got very weary. They got very weary of doing that, and over time, they're blowing, as we say in Greece. When somebody gets burned, they start to blow on the yogurt. That they get fearful of anybody reminding them of the Pantalemonites or something. So the two extremes never solve anything, and we've got to avoid those and stay on the royal path. And that's very hard to do today because there's not a lot of discernment among a lot of us, right? Because that presupposes a lot of spiritual advancement.
All right, Father John, 3 minutes.
Well, there's a lot of issues that I would like to address. A couple quick points. One is that
Millennium Falcon speed.
In the 19th century, Russia brought a group of Nestorians into the church. So the idea of bringing groups like that back into communion is not something that's new. As a matter of fact, one of those bishops was a bishop in ROCOR, and you can find pictures of him right next to Metropolitan Anthony Kropotvitsky. Another one is just about one of the problems with old calendarists, and I again want to say that I'm sympathetic with them because I know that many of them are very sincere people, and they've been scandalized by things that they should have been scandalized by. It's just that their solution is not so good. But the problem with the old calendarists is that they, for one thing, they cause a lot of confusion in people. For people who are looking into Orthodoxy, when they start discovering that groups like this exist, it becomes a problem for them. You have a group like ROAC in America, for example, that has 3 whole parishes. And if you would believe them, that's what's left of the Russian mission in North America after more than 200 years. And their bishop is Archbishop Andrei Maklakov, who was Andrew McLaughlin, but he changed his name to make it sound Russian. I mean, these are squirrely weirdisms that you find in a lot of these things. A lot of people become old calendarists for good reasons, but there are people who become old calendarists for bad reasons. And the current head of the mainstream Greek old calendar church in North America comes from the Pantalemonites, who broke from ROCOR in 1986 under Saint Vitali because they were covering for a spiritual predator. I mean, a sexual predator. And so people like that seek out groups like this because there's less accountability when you're in these small splinter groups and you're not having to answer to anybody else. And one quick quote, and I'll probably run out of time. But this is what Father Seraphim Rose had to say about ecumenism. He said, ecumenism itself is not a clear-cut heresy like Arianism or a clearly distinguishable body such as the Roman Catholic Church. It is seldom preached boldly in so many words by its Orthodox participants, and even when outrageous statements are made by Patriarchs Athenagoras and Demetrius, or by the New Thyatira Confession. They are often accompanied by at least a verbal confession that Orthodoxy still is the one true Church of Christ. There is therefore some justification for those who refuse to break off with ecumenist hierarchs, or who do not know at what point they actually become heretics. I personally would not stay under some of these bishops, and I'm glad to be where I'm at. But I do think that we can't judge people who are in some of these jurisdictions because of what Father Saffron Rose was pointing to back then, that there is ambiguity. And so when one bishop says some stupid things, the question is does the whole Synod agree with that? In the case of the ecumenical patriarchate, for me, I would already be past
you're
that
over
point.
time, Father. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry.
All right. And Father Joseph, I'll let you take us over 3 hours and take approximately 6 minutes if you want them. Father Joseph.
Muted.
You're muted, Father Joseph.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so basically, I think this has been a very revealing debate in a number of different ways. We have seen a whole bunch of things redefined past the normal, the most glaring. It was nice to have Father Peter on with Father John. They kind of complemented each other. It was great. But Father Peter mentioned that those following Canon 15 who separate from, say, people who are communing with the Monophysites are under no condemnation. They're under no punishment. But that's the opposite of the import of the canon, which specifically says that not only are they not subject to canonical penalty for walling themselves off from the communion of the so-called bishop, that is pseudo-bishop in Greek, it actually says, before synodical clarification, but they shall be deemed worthy of honor, due honor among the Orthodox, for not bishops, but false bishops, and false teachers have they condemned, and they have not fragmented the church's unity with schism, but from schisms and divisions have they earnestly sought to deliver the church. That entire part was missing in this discussion, and that's really too bad, because ultimately, while Father Peter admits to a theoretical possibility of breaking from communion, he can't admit to actually doing it with Antioch, because then they'd have to remain in communion with Constantinople, commemorating Rome. They'd have to remain in communion with Moscow, who's actively in the WCC. They'd have to remain in communion with Bulgaria, all of their bishops who were exposed as KGB like 5 years ago. Maybe the OCA, where some of their bishops believe Origen's a saint and the Fifth Ecumenical Council was wrong. And so when you put it all together, in the end, there's no place to go. And that's why people keep talking about like scattered old calendars, blah, blah, because there's millions of true Orthodox in Greece, in Russia, in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Georgia, in Asia, South America, in Europe. The point is, we're all over the place. I once knew a guy who passionately argued for canonical orthodoxy while celebrating in a house church because the 3 historical churches around him in France were true Orthodox. The point is, we're growing. We're going to continue growing on that. And as to what Father John said about Archbishop Andre, I personally have spoken to Archbishop Andre a few times. I do not always agree with Archbishop Andre a few times. The ROAC Synod does not agree with Archbishop Andre because they occasionally will celebrate feasts with our own Russian Synod, and he says there's no concelebration. Fine, okay. We didn't say it was a concelebration, but we do try to be nice to each other. Metropolitan Demetrius, I've spoken to him personally, and he admits a lot of his people, including himself, they made mistakes when it came to Father Pantaleimon. They know. That's part of the reason why they broke off in 2014, 11, I don't remember. But the point is, Pantaleimon admitted guilt. The man's dead. Like, these are people who have learned to move on. And that's my point, is that those people ready to move on in Orthodoxy, who've had enough of the ecumenism, who've had enough. Like, I mean, sure, you may not like those particular bishops. You may not have spoken to them enough. But I would rather be under a very flawed bishop than a very well-organized heretic. And I think most Orthodox Christians would be as well. And I will finally finish this with a quote from Father Seraphim Rose's Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. Many of them follow the bishops of the few Orthodox jurisdictions that have taken a strong stand against the apostasy of our time. What happened here? Hello?
Yeah.
What
I can
happened?
hear you.
Okay. Taking a strong stand against the apostasy of our times. The Catacomb Church of Russia, ROCOR, the True Orthodox Christians of Greece. That's a quote from Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, which does not exist in any current text of Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future because it was literally deleted. Father Peter has brought up that he was not a fan of that, which I respect, but unfortunately it still happened. With that in mind, come to my YouTube channel, visit all the True Orthodox sites you want. There's thousands, millions of True Orthodox all over the world, and find the ones from, most of them aren't in America though, because Orthodoxy in America is terrible. We have a very tiny part of the total American population and a lot of work to do no matter where you are. So thank you for having me, and thank you, Father John and Father Peter. Nice to meet you.
This is Dispel Conspiracy Theory. Did Craig start the live late on purpose, shut down Father Joseph's live on NFTU? Wouldn't it be the opposite?
No,
what right? Like if I started late and you got to go longer, I would have been helping you.
I can answer this because a lot of people were confused. We had about 50 people in our cross stream that wanted to watch it on my channel, but StreamYard didn't allow both of those. So as soon as you went live, it shut off the
we were texting back and forth also sort of about something on it. And it's just like, I'm just happy I haven't had a slowdown on this stream. I'm not good at technology. And my main concern is spending time with my kid, make sure my wife put him to bed, all that stuff, the things I do before I do a show. So don't need a conspiracy for that. And we'll end on this note. Take us out on a nice bridge building laugh. Coconut or chocolate donutism?
Donutism.
Get it? Donutism. So there you go. We got that. So, Father Peter, thank you so much for popping on. Father Joseph, Father John, great as always, investing so much time in unpacking this. It really is a challenge to try to do all these issues, and really the utility of this format is for people to write down the topics and then start doing the research themselves and getting the documented evidence themselves. So I commend everyone to do that. I will otherwise point people again, if this has blessed you, to like, share, and subscribe, and also to support the missionary work in Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. I will end this show, as I end all of them, by quoting Jesus Sirach, fight to the death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.